In the deepest vaults of the Eternal Crusade, before he was the voice of Dorn or the hero of Helsreach, Merek Grimaldus was a child of fire, shaped by ritual, battle, and the silent expectations of those who watched him from the shadows of the Reclusium. His name would not echo through the halls of the Imperium for many decades, yet already the sparks of his legend had begun to kindle. Grimaldus's induction into the Black Templars was like countless others, violent, ritualistic, and absolute. Recruited from a feral world whose name is lost to imperial records, he came to the Templars not as a noble soul seeking honor, but as a weapon waiting to be honed. There was no warmth in the crucibles of his initiation. There were no kind words, only tests, trials, agony. The chapter taught its aspirants the Emperor's truth through pain, and Grimaldus absorbed it with a quiet, burning focus that unnerved even his overseers. From the first, Merek was noted for his silence, not from fear or reverence, but from a grim resolve. Where others shouted war cries, he moved through trials with wordless determination. He did not ask questions, he did not weep when others broke. He endured. That, above all, marked him. As a neophyte, he was assigned to a sword brother named Helsreach, a grizzled veteran known for breaking recruits with his impossible standards. Under Helsreach, Grimaldus learned the harsh creed of the Black Templars. To crusade was to exist, to kneel was to die, and to speak of doubt was heresy. His mentor did not believe in mercy, and neither did the path he carved for the boy. They fought together in a dozen boarding actions and suppression campaigns, carving through pirates and mutants along the Garan expanse. There was no glory to be found there, only endurance and death. Grimaldus saw both in equal measure. During the siege of Firewake Spire, a minor but bloody campaign against a techno-heretic enclave, Helsreach fell. A malfunctioning sentry turret barrage tore through the veteran's helm. Grimaldus, barely more than a neophyte, carried Helsreach's body through collapsing tunnels and into orbit, alone and under fire. It was the first time his name was spoken with weight. He returned to the Crusade fleet, limping and smoke-stained, but unbroken. His silence was no longer ignored. It was respected. With Helsreach dead, Grimaldus stood at a crossroads. Many expected him to join the Sword Brethren properly. His combat record had already eclipsed many of his peers. But instead, he was summoned to the Reclusiarch. The chaplains had taken notice. Merek did not resist the call. In truth, he welcomed it. To serve in the Reclusiarch was to serve as the soul of the chapter. The chaplains did not merely inspire, they judged. They did not only bless weapons, they forged the unshakable conviction that wielded them. And Merek was already becoming a vessel for unrelenting purpose. His training as an acolyte of the Reclusium began aboard the Eternal Crusader itself. The process was merciless. The chaplains subjected their initiates to psychological trials, exposure to forbidden texts, isolation in vaults filled with relics of martyred Templars. Grimaldus did not merely endure it, he immersed himself in it. While others whispered Dorn's name with reverence, he learned to carry his fury. While others clung to litanies like crutches, he recited them as declarations of war. What separated him was not charisma. It was the weight of his faith. In Merek Grimaldus, the Reclusiarch found someone who could bear that weight and never falter. Years passed. Crusades were fought and forgotten by all, save the Imperium's annals. Grimaldus grew, not in voice or stature, but in presence. Even among older chaplains, he radiated a cold, focused intensity. He rarely spoke unless delivering a sermon, but when he did, the effect was searing. His words carried the weight of pain endured and faith proven. A mere glance from him could still a panicking line of guardsmen. A single phrase could ignite a battle brother's zeal into madness. Then came the martyrdom of Mordred. Reclusiarch Mordred was a legend in the Black Templars, a hero of 1,000 worlds and countless crusades. He had tutored chaplains, slain demon princes, and stood beside High Marshal Helbrecht during the cleansing of Orvan Hive. When Mordred fell during the siege of Helsreach, killed by a chaos sorcerer whose name was scoured from the records, it sent shockwaves through the chapter. Mourning was brief. The crusade allowed no time for sorrow. The question of succession emerged at once. Many veterans were considered. Grimaldus, at the time, was still seen by some as too young, too unyielding, too severe even by Templar standards. But the Reclusiam decided otherwise. They named him Reclusiarch. There was no ceremony, no parade, just a new title, a new Crozius, and an unspoken expectation that he would rise to meet it. And he did. In that moment, the boy forged in fire, and silence became something more. Not a hero, not yet, but a weapon made ready for a fate that would one day shape a planet and define his legacy. Grimaldus would soon be called to a war that would test the very marrow of his soul. But in the vaults of the Eternal Crusader, where relics whispered of sacrifice and centuries of bloodshed, he stood alone for one final moment, in silent prayer, in preparation. The novitiate flame had become an inferno. The title of Reclusiarch was a crown forged in fire, and Grimaldus wore it with the grim solemnity of one who knew only war. His ascension to that rank sent murmurs through the chapter, not of discontent, but of awe cloaked in unease. He was the youngest ever to bear the mantle within the Black Templars, a warrior priest elevated above veterans who had bled across 100 campaigns. In a chapter that revered hierarchy earned through unrelenting combat, such a rise was not unheard of, but it was rare and never without consequence. Merek Grimaldus did not celebrate. He did not question. He accepted the burden without outward emotion, as though he had always known it would come. In truth, the Reclusiam had seen it long before others had. Where some required centuries to embody their sacred office, Merek had walked that path from the moment he had first invoked the name of the Emperor beneath a blood-soaked sun. As Reclusiarch, his duties changed. He no longer answered to another chaplain, nor did he merely recite the litanies of hatred before a charge. He became a shepherd of souls, responsible not only for the morale of warriors in battle, but for the purity of their belief across entire crusades. Every crusading force he accompanied would be shaped by his sermons, his judgment, his wrath. The Templars of his charge did not greet him with cheers. They saluted in silence, fists to chest, eyes glinting with both reverence and trepidation. He had yet to prove himself in this new role. That proof would come in blood. His first test as Reclusiarch came during the Pale Scourging, an unholy uprising on the ash-stained world of Kovar Prime. A chaos cult, long dormant, erupted with demonic fury, catching the local PDF and a scattering of Astra Militarum regiments off guard. The Black Templars answered, led by Marshal Helsreach and Reclusiarch Grimaldus at his side. The campaign was brutal. Cities melted under plague winds, manufactorums burned in sorcerous flame, and civilians screamed prayers to both the Emperor and the ruinous powers alike. It was in this crucible that Grimaldus forged his legend anew, not as a battle brother or a survivor, but as a leader of the soul. It was said he walked into the ruins of Cather Spire alone, his Crozius crackling with black gold light, and emerged hours later dragging the shattered, still-burning husk of a corrupted cardinal. Behind him followed 20 PDF troopers who had been days from desertion, now resworn to the God Emperor with tears streaming down soot-streaked faces. Grimaldus's voice became a weapon on the battlefield. He would stride across no man's lands under heavy fire, bellowing war litanies and absolving oaths, emboldening Black Templars who had fought without rest. He called down hatred like thunder and turned prayer into fury. Enemies who heard his voice sometimes faltered, if only for a heartbeat, and in that heartbeat his warriors struck like the wrath of gods. Marshal Helsreach took notice, so did High Marshal Helbrecht. But Grimaldus was not interested in acclaim. He remained cold, focused, and silent outside of sermons and battle. He did not socialize with his peers, nor seek counsel. His time was spent among relics and rites. To many within the Reclusium, he appeared as if carved from stone, unshakable, eternal. Behind closed doors, however, there were moments of isolation that no warrior could completely banish. Grimaldus's private chambers aboard the Hymn of Vengeance were austere to the point of discomfort. Bare rockcrete walls, an iron shrine, and a single flickering lumen. The skull of Helsreach, his first mentor, rested in a stasis field at the foot of the altar. It was to this relic that Grimaldus spoke, not out of madness, but in quiet respect. "Your judgment still weighs," he once said in the silence. "I carry it into every battle." For every victory he delivered, for every soul he redeemed, the weight upon his back grew. Faith was no longer only his weapon. It had become his burden. The battles did not relent. From the poison skies of Varela Secundus to the void duels of the Carnian Rift, Grimaldus led crusading forces into wars of annihilation. He was tireless, never requesting respite, never retreating. His presence aboard a fleet became both a promise and a warning. The Emperor's fury would be made manifest, and there would be no survivors for the unclean. It was during the Goran cleansing that his legend hardened into myth. A splinter cult of the Word-Bearers had infected a forge moon orbiting a Mechanicus stronghold. The cultists had weaponized the rites of the Omnissiah, turning machine spirits into maddened, corrupted abominations. Entire manufactorums became Heartech-infested warrens. The Mechanicus requested exterminatus. Grimaldus objected. He boarded the station with 3 squads of initiates, 2 sword brothers, and a Cenobite servitor carrying relic shrines behind him. For 9 hours they fought through smoke-choked corridors and blood-slicked gantries. It was Grimaldus who struck down the false Magos, burning him with a fragment of the Temple of Iron Will, a relic stone salvaged from a battlefield long forgotten. The artifact scorched the heretic's soul from its body with righteous flame. When the station was cleansed, he returned alone. All others had fallen, the Cenobite shattered, the relics saved. The Mechanicus requested his genetic material for analysis. They believed he might be blessed by the Omnissiah. He refused. Each campaign deepened his mystique. Rumors began to spread that Grimaldus had died a dozen times and risen again, or that he had spoken with the Emperor during a near-death wound. Grimaldus never corrected these tales, nor did he deny them. In truth, he found them irrelevant. Faith was not built upon truth. It was forged through action. His sermons grew harsher, his silences longer. There were whispers among the Reclusium that perhaps he would one day be chosen to lead them all, to become High Chaplain of the entire chapter. Some doubted his temperament, others believed him destined. But even the most zealous warrior cannot foresee what lies beyond the stars. When the call came from the Armageddon subsector, when the name of Helsreach Hive echoed across Vox and Astropath alike, Grimaldus answered without hesitation. High Marshal Helbrecht summoned him personally, charging him with leading the defense of that hive against the coming storm. Grimaldus accepted with a bowed head. He did not ask why the Templars had been chosen. He did not ask why him. He only asked how long they had to prepare. The orcs were coming, and Merek Grimaldus would meet them in fire, faith, and fury. Before Merek Grimaldus could become the beacon of Helsreach, before his sermons echoed across the ruins of hives, and his name became a symbol etched into the hearts of billions, there stood another, Reclusiarch Mordred. He was the flame in the Reclusium before Grimaldus, a towering figure in both presence and legend, and it was his fall that carved the void Grimaldus would be forced to fill. Mordred was no mere warrior priest. He was the hammer of judgment within the Black Templars, a soul utterly consumed by righteous fury. It was said that even High Marshal Helbrecht listened when Mordred spoke. His Crozius had shattered traitor helms on Caddoc Prime, silenced Xenos warlords in the Carinth Rift, and burned the symbols of heresy into dust. For many within the Reclusium, he was the template of perfection, unyielding, absolute, and bound by a faith so pure it had become weaponized. Grimaldus revered him, but reverence within the Black Templars was never expressed in flattery or words. Instead, he watched, he studied. From the shadows of chapels and under the weight of battle banners, Merek observed every sermon Mordred gave, every silence he allowed to hang before condemning the faithless. He saw the precision of a man who had not only memorized the sacred texts, but lived them until every syllable was bone deep. But such icons do not last forever. The end came during the siege of Helsreach, a fortress world pressed under a rising tide of chaos forces. Cults had sprouted like tumors across the southern hemisphere, their rites calling down warp storms that severed communication and stifled reinforcements. The Black Templars answered the call, launching a spearhead assault led by Marshal Harag, with Mordred at his side. Merek Grimaldus was there. He was not yet Reclusiarch, still a rising voice among the chaplains, yet one who had begun to earn quiet recognition. He had been assigned to lead rites of fortification in the northern bastion of Hive Star, overseeing the morale of several companies, and a Mechanicus cohort tasked with sealing the ancient reliquary gates. It was a secondary theater until the warp opened beneath their feet. On the fourth night of siege, the sky split. A massive breach tore through the clouds above Gervanis, and with it came something that had no name, only titles. A demon prince of Tzinch, a being of silver fire and twisting prophecy, emerged from the warp and descended upon the central spire of Hive Steer like a falling comet. Panic gripped the defenders. Astra Militarum forces fled their posts. Mechanicus tech adepts attempted to activate scorched earth protocols, and the Forge Knights deployed in the wrong direction entirely. The breach was absolute. Only one remained at the heart of the assault, Mordred. He did not hesitate. While psychers screamed and machine spirits wailed, Mordred activated his Crozius and walked through the fire. No armor could protect him from the warp's whispers, and no shield could defend against the madness that boiled from the demon's arrival. Yet he kept walking. Grimaldus arrived too late to stop him. His own forces had been ambushed by cultist fanatics wielding warp-forged relics, and he had been forced to carve a path through the seething mobs. By the time he reached the cathedral square, Mordred had already engaged the demon. It was a battle of madness and meaning. Fire collided with faith, and the air screamed with the weight of broken reality. The demon prince changed shape with every strike, sometimes a towering bird-wreathed monstrosity, sometimes a robed prophet with eyes like galaxies, sometimes a child's face warped in agony. But Mordred never stopped. His litanies shook the plaza. His faith turned back the unnatural, if only briefly. Grimaldus could do nothing but watch. He later described the moment not with awe, but with silence. The silence of helplessness. The silence of witnessing something greater than anything he had ever known. Then came the end. The demon surged forward in a spiral of burning glyphs, and Mordred's Crozius shattered against its breast. There was a sound like glass breaking across eternity. Warp light engulfed the cathedral square, and then nothing. When the smoke cleared, Mordred was gone, not slain, not devoured, gone. No corpse, no blood, only a scorched imprint of his boots etched into the blackened stone. The Black Templars recovered the shattered haft of his Crozius and the purity seal he had worn since the Saurakon Crusade. The relics were sealed within a reliquary chamber aboard the Eternal Crusader, and for many, the memory of Mordred became sacred myth. Grimaldus did not speak of what he had seen. He did not describe the battle. He did not weep. But something had changed. The Reclusiarch gathered shortly after. There was no debate, no vote. The surviving chaplains assembled within the halls of reflection, the black-armored walls lit only by votive candles, and announced their choice. Merek Grimaldus would be named Reclusiarch. He did not seek it. He did not ask for it. And yet, the weight of Mordred's legacy fell upon his shoulders without protest. Grimaldus accepted the title with a bowed head and a silent oath. There was no feast, no sermon, only a moment, carved in stone, unseen by the galaxy, where the youngest chaplain to ascend to the rank in the history of the chapter took up the black mantle of the dead. Helsreach himself summoned Grimaldus to his war chamber weeks later. There were few words spoken. "You stood where Mordred fell," the High Marshal said. "Do not try to fill his shadow. Make your own." Grimaldus returned to the Reclusiarch and stood before the relics of Mordred. He did not pray. He did not speak. He simply stood, his eyes burning beneath the skull helm. The martyr had passed. The voice of the chapter now belonged to Merek Grimaldus. The flame had not gone out. It had changed hands. There is a sacred moment within the life of every Black Templar, a moment where steel and soul are bound by unbreakable promise, not in the simple act of donning armor, nor even in the raising of blade against Xenos or heretic, but in the forging of personal war vows. These are not mere formalities. These oaths are sacred covenants, drawn in blood and fire, binding each warrior's will to the Emperor's cause unto death. For Merek Grimaldus, these vows were more than tradition. They were prophecy. Following his ascension to Reclusiarch, Grimaldus returned not to a throne, but to war. The Black Templars do not linger in halls of ceremony. Their path is paved with ash and the bones of the unfaithful. It was aboard the battle barge Eternal Crusader, the very heart of the Black Templars' war fleets, that Grimaldus took his first vows as a Reclusiarch. These were not the oaths of a novice or a sword brother. These were the vows of a soul forged to guide others, an anointed shepherd of wrath, preparing to ignite the galaxy with faith. Inside the Chapel of Steel, a sanctum deep within the heart of the Eternal Crusader, the ceremony began. The chamber was lit only by the dim flame of purification censers, their smoke drifting through the skull-adorned icons of Sigismund and Dorn. Servo skulls hovered silently above, chanting fractured scripture. Racks of relics lined the walls, shattered swords of fallen Templars, bolter casings etched with the names of martyred champions, the rusted helm of a hero lost during the age of apostasy. This was no place for spectators. Only purity entered this chamber. Grimaldus approached the altar alone. He wore his newly reforged war plate, polished black ceramite, etched with runes of hate and redemption. At his side hung the Crozius of Mordred's line, reforged from the shattered haft recovered from Helsreach. He had not yet wielded it in battle. That moment would come after the vow. Grimaldus knelt before the relic shrine, silent for nearly an hour. The only sound was the low murmur of litanies from the chapel walls, played from echo cylinders older than the Imperium's current calendar. Finally, when the time came, he stood, raised his crozius, and spoke, not to the gathered chaplains, not to the echoes of the Templar dead, but to the Emperor himself. I vow to carry the weight of a fallen martyr and raise it as fire in the eyes of the faithful. I vow to wield my silence as a spear and my voice as judgment. I vow to defend the sacred relics with every drop of my soul and to guide those who bear them unto martyrdom if need be. I vow to see weakness burned from the flesh of brothers. I vow to give them war. It was a short vow, far shorter than most, yet none present questioned it. Each word was final. With that vow, Grimaldus was bound to the Eternal Crusade, not as a servant, but as one of its chosen instruments. He would lead those sworn to the path of fire and blade. He would ignite belief where there was only despair. And he would judge those who faltered with neither pity nor hesitation. His first campaign as a fully anointed Reclusiarch under his new vow came swiftly. A distress call from the mining world of Draxon 5 arrived via astropathic channel. The inhabitants had ceased all communication, and orbital augurs detected no life signals from the primary hives. A small crusade fleet under Marshal Tiberius was dispatched to investigate. Grimaldus accompanied them, commanding the spiritual integrity of 3 full fighting companies and their neophytes. Upon arrival, they found the world not dead, but silenced. The hives stood intact, but the people were gone. No bodies, no wreckage, only stillness. The Vox channels returned echoes of whispered prayers, looping fragments of catechisms interrupted mid-recitation. The Templars descended into Hive Dorn, where the darkness grew so thick the torches flickered with warp-burned edges. And there, beneath the cathedral towers and manufactorum ruins, they found it. The silent choir. A new cult masked in imperial rites had taken root. Their high priest, a rogue psyker, had weaponized the emperor's words, binding faith itself into a warp conduit that drained the will from all who prayed. The people had not fled or died. They had willingly surrendered their souls, believing they were ascending into holy rapture. It was heresy hidden behind liturgy, and it enraged Grimaldus more than any demon ever could. He descended alone into the heart of the choir's sanctum, where thousands of kneeling figures wept silently, their faces frozen in joyless exultation. The rogue psyker, wearing a mask of bone and wielding a staff wreathed in psychic flame, stood atop the altar. Grimaldus did not hesitate. He raised his crozius and spoke a single litany, a battle prayer of silencing flame, and charged. No fire met him, no lightning, no resistance. The choir simply died. The moment his voice cut through the sanctuary, the warp bond that held the cult together ruptured. The psyker screamed and was consumed in a blaze of golden fire, collapsing into ash at the foot of his throne. The choir fell with him, dead by soul, their bodies unmoving. Grimaldus stood in the silence afterward, surrounded by corpses, and muttered only one phrase: "Let them speak in death what they did not in life." The Templars sealed the hive and destroyed the planet's last communication spires. The Administratum later recorded Draxon 5 as lost to atmospheric toxin exposure. No mention was made of the choir. The Templars had done what they always did, eradicated the impure and left no trace. But among the chaplains, the tale spread quickly. Grimaldus's vow had not even cooled, and already it had been tested in warp-tainted fire. From that point onward, every time he entered a battlefield, his vow echoed with renewed weight. It was not just remembered by him, but by others. Whispers carried between chapels and thundered through litanies. Reclusiarch Merek Grimaldus had made his oaths before the Eternal Crusade, and now the galaxy would learn what it meant when a Templar kept his word. The galaxy is a furnace, and Merek Grimaldus was its hammer. But even for a soul forged in constant war, the summons to Armageddon was unlike anything he had faced. It was not a mere battlefield. It was a graveyard of faith, where the strength of one's oaths would be measured against a tide of green-skinned fury the size of a system. Armageddon had burned before. Twice the orcs had come. Twice the world had survived, barely. But this time it would be different. Gazgkul Mag Uruk Thraka, the prophet of the Wa, had returned, and with him came a force of such scale that even the High Lords of Terra shuddered. Hive worlds burned, astropathic choirs screamed and burst into flame. Orc warbands eclipsed entire continents. No mere invasion, this was a cataclysm made flesh. High Marshal Helsreach received the call for aid personally. The Black Templars had been engaged in a deep-range crusade beyond the Galanor reaches when the call came. Word of Armageddon's plight tore through the fleet like fire through a dry chapel. The crusade was halted instantly. Without pause or dissent, Helsreach redirected the entirety of the Templar Armada toward the doomed world. But he would not lead every front himself. The battle would be vast, spanning hives, deserts, and orbital voids. The Black Templars would fight in many places, yet one location, one vital hive, would require not only warriors, but a symbol, a blade of righteousness wrapped in flesh and unshakable will. That hive was Helsreach, and the warrior chosen to defend it was Merek Grimaldus. The order came not as a request, but as a statement, a direct assignment from Helsreach himself, spoken through a private Vox channel aboard the Eternal Crusader. Grimaldus listened in silence. No reason was given. None was needed. He bowed once, accepted the burden, and made preparations for immediate deployment. But many questioned the decision. Why assign the Reclusiarch, a master of faith, not strategy, to a hive that required coordination with the Imperial Guard, the Navy, and the Steel Legion's rigid command structure? Why place Grimaldus, a voice of hate and fury, among mortals who required structure and logic? Helsreach did not answer. Perhaps he understood something others did not, that Helsreach would not be saved by tactics alone. It would require belief. And belief is what Merek Grimaldus forged into steel. The journey to Armageddon was brief, accelerated by warp routes pre-charted from previous campaigns. As the Templar fleet approached the war-torn world, Vox traffic swelled into chaos. Even hardened ship crews struggled to maintain composure. Tens of thousands of distress signals overlapped with military command orders. Orc jamming signals mixed with cries for reinforcement. Every channel wept madness. Grimaldus remained silent through it all, reviewing tactical maps of Helsreach, its cathedral districts, manufactorum lines, promethium refineries, and shield sectors. He memorized every street, every choke point, every sacred site. He did not look at casualty estimates. He already knew they would be high. When his Thunderhawk landed upon the upper bastion of Helsreach's spire of martyrs, he stepped out into a sky already darkened by smoke. Imperial banners hung in tatters. Astra Militarum officers saluted half-heartedly, weary from weeks of anticipation and dwindling morale. There to meet him was Commissar Yarrick, the old man of Armageddon. A living legend in his own right, Yarrick had fought in every major war on the planet, a man whose name made orcs snarl and guardsmen salute with trembling fists. Their meeting was brief, formal, and silent. No words of admiration, no posturing, just a nod of mutual understanding, two relics of faith, two instruments of will, and they both knew Helsreach would be a slaughterhouse. Grimaldus was given command of the Black Templar forces assigned to the Hive. Their numbers were limited, a force of roughly 200 Astartes, reinforced by several Cenobite servitors bearing relics and war standards, each one hand-picked. each one prepared to die. But Grimaldus didn't see mere warriors. He saw vessels of sacred flame. Every Templar under his command received personal absolution from him upon arrival. In the chapel of blazing martyrs, converted from a crumbling civilian temple, he delivered one of his most chilling sermons. You are not here to survive. You are not here to hold the line. You are here to bleed, to burn, and to bury the enemy beneath our ashes. You are here to die as legends. They did not cheer. They saluted. The defense of Helsreach would be no ordinary deployment. The hive was a vital industrial artery, producing promethium, munitions, and void fuel by the megaton. But more than that, it was holy. Within its walls stood the Temple of the Emperor Ascendant, a monument said to be built on the site of a long-forgotten vision of the Emperor himself. To Grimaldus, that was all that mattered. He spent days inspecting every inch of the hive's defenses, much to the frustration of Imperial commanders who bristled at his disregard for protocol. He ignored them. He walked the walls. He visited the cathedrals. He spoke to no one unless necessary. But everywhere he went, soldiers stood straighter, servitors lowered their gazes, and whispers began to spread. The Reclusiarch walks among us, the one who hears the Emperor's voice. Tensions brewed early. Captain Tainer of the Steel Legion protested openly about placing a chaplain in strategic command. Grimaldus responded by reciting the entire litany of burning martyrs from memory, then suggesting Tainer assign himself to rear-guard duty, if his courage was not equal to the moment. The insult was noted, but not challenged. In private, Grimaldus recorded a message for Helbrecht, a rare moment of candor. I see what you intended. You did not send me to hold Helsreach. You sent me to sanctify it. As the hours passed, the orcs drew closer. Seismic readings showed thousands of vehicles crossing the ash wastes, stompus, battle wagons, trucks, and gargants that turned the ground to molten dust. They came not in columns, but in chaotic waves. Every kilometer they advanced was marked with banners of blood and metal teeth. As the sun set on the fourth day, Grimaldus climbed the central spire of the hive and stood beneath the golden aquila. From there, he could see the black clouds rising from the horizon. Helsreach would soon be encircled. He looked to the east, where the Temple of the Emperor Ascendant rose like a defiant fist against the sky. He whispered a single vow. I will not let this flame be extinguished. The march to Armageddon was complete. Now the war would begin. The skies above Helsreach broke open like a wounded beast. On the seventh day, the storm came, not of rain or wind, but of iron and fire. The orcs did not advance with subtlety. They roared forward in a tide of crude armor, smoke-belching engines, and cannons fashioned from scrap metal and brutal cunning. The war was no longer a rumor on the horizon. It was a grinding, screaming ocean of violence, and it had come to devour the hive whole. For many defenders, this was the end. For Merek Grimaldus, it was the beginning. He stood atop the western wall bastion, black robes billowing behind him as the first shells slammed into the hive's outer districts. The sound of the bombardment was deafening, artillery shrieking through the air, towers collapsing in plumes of concrete, dust, and flame. Vox traffic erupted in static-laced panic. Civilian districts were hit first, and screams poured through open channels before they were silenced one by one. Grimaldus did not flinch. The Templars at his side, veterans hardened by decades of crusades, remained perfectly still, awaiting the signal to advance. They had not come to hide behind walls. They had come to meet the tide. Commissar Yarek's warnings had not been exaggerated. The orcs were not merely attacking. They were swarming with an intelligence far beyond their usual behavior. Massive gargants led the charge, their footsteps shaking the hive foundations. Ramshackle aircraft strafed the defensive bastions. Trucks and war bikes wove between the wreckage, carrying mobs of howling greenskins, wielding everything from cleavers to plasma cutters. The first engagement began at Sector 17 Gamma, a Prometheum processing zone recently reinforced by Templar squads and Steel Legion armored regiments. At 9:43 local time, the Orcs breached the outer barricade in a three-pronged assault. Meltabombs ripped through the reinforced gates, and within minutes the outer platforms were overrun. Grimaldus led the counter-strike personally. Descending from the bastion via thunderous drop pod, he landed in the heart of the breach, with his Cenobite servitors dragging holy reliquaries behind him. The impact crater still steamed when he rose from it, Crozius blazing with sacred energy, and charged into the fray. The Orcs did not hesitate. They were drawn to him immediately, perhaps sensing the authority he carried, or simply craving a worthy fight. They crashed against his position like a green tide, but Grimaldus stood his ground. He moved with brutal precision, every swing of his Crozius shattering skulls, ripping through torsos, and sending sparks of righteous flame bursting across the battlefield. Around him, the Black Templars advanced with bolters roaring, forming a living wall of ceramite and hate. The battle became a grinding stalemate, with Templars holding choke points while Steel Legion tanks rumbled in from the flanks to lay down suppressive fire. The enemy's numbers were unending. For every Orc cut down, 5 more surged forward, but Grimaldus did not relent. He stood at the front line for 11 hours without pause. His voice echoed over the Vox in litanies of purity and death. He called upon Dorn, upon Sigismund, upon the Emperor himself. The defenders, flagging under the endless waves, found themselves emboldened. When the final Orc was dragged screaming beneath the treads of a Leman Russ, the Templars were soaked in blood, armor rent and torn. Grimaldus alone stood unmarred, his armor blackened but intact, his Crozius still burning with residual heat. He did not celebrate, he did not rest. He ordered the dead stacked into pyres, blessed the ashes, and moved to the next defense line. As night fell, Helsreach burned, but it still stood. The next 2 days were an unbroken gauntlet of warfare. Orcs adapted quickly. They began targeting the Hive spires with looted aircraft, crude jets and bombers patched together with luck and fury. Flak batteries struggled to stem the tide. A massive airstrike on the eastern district collapsed the Skybridge Basilica, killing hundreds and cutting a vital transit route. Grimaldus responded with fury. He organized kill teams of Templars and veteran PDF to enter the ruins, slay the looters, and reclaim holy relics before they were defiled. He led one such team himself into the catacombs beneath the basilica, where he discovered Orcs attempting to pry open a stasis-sealed reliquary. Inside was the skull of Saint Minara, a martyr of the age of apostasy. Grimaldus recovered it personally and carried it back to the chapel of the Emperor Ascendant, where he placed it on the altar. "You will not be forgotten," he whispered. "Not while I draw breath." The act became symbolic. Rumors spread among the defenders that the Reclusiarch could not be killed, that he walked unharmed through fire and ruin, carrying relics and wrath in equal measure. To the Orcs, he became a target of obsession. They called him the Bone Face, a monster in black who shouted thunder and brought nothing but death. Several war bands diverted from key objectives simply to try and reach him, eager for the glory of slaying the black-armored prophet. None succeeded. Most were turned to pulp beneath bolter fire before they ever reached his position. But not all wounds were physical. The strain wore down the defenders. Fatigue set in. Steel Legion soldiers fought on broken limbs. Templar neophytes died in droves, some without ever drawing their chainswords. The smell of burning promethium became as constant as prayer. Grimaldus, too, felt the weight. He kept a private ledger of names. Each night, when the battle subsided just enough for silence to settle in, he would sit beside the flame of the chapel and recite the names of the fallen aloud. Not just Astartes, but guardsmen, tech priests, even civilians, one by one, each name a stone placed at the base of his soul. The orcs pushed harder. On the 10th day, a gargant reached the outer bastion. Towering over the walls, bristling with cannons and plasma belchers, it began tearing apart the defense lines with brutal efficiency. Last fire and missiles did little to halt it. Artillery batteries ran dry. Grimaldus made his decision. He ordered an orbital lance strike, knowing it would take a full district with it. He stood on the wall, vox amplified, and addressed the men of that district, those still fighting, those wounded and hiding, those praying in the shelters. Your death is not an end. It is a foundation. You will not be remembered for what you lost, but for what you saved. The Emperor knows your names. When the lance struck, it carved a line of white fire through the battlefield. The gargant vanished in a burst of atomic light. So did hundreds of Imperial defenders. No one questioned the order, because Helsreach still stood. Grimaldus descended to the ruins that night. He walked among the ash, found the scorched remains of a guardsman's helmet, and placed it on a spike beside the chapel gate. Your faith was enough. He would do this again and again. For every life taken by necessity, he left a token, a marker, a sign that sacrifice was not unseen. This was not strategy. This was theology by fire. The iron tide of Helsreach had come, and Merek Grimaldus had not broken. It rose from the scorched earth like a monument defying apocalypse. The Temple of the Emperor Ascendant, Helsreach's most sacred site, a towering cathedral of steel and stone built atop legends and bones, stood as both spiritual heart and tactical keystone of the hive. It was ancient, reinforced with adamantium veins, and flanked by statues carved in the likenesses of martyrs long forgotten. Its spires scraped the soot-choked sky, its bells silent in the wake of war. For most, it was a place of worship. For Merek Grimaldus, it was a battleground waiting to be sanctified. The orcs knew it held value. Though incapable of understanding its theological weight, they recognized power. Perhaps it was the way Imperial defenders clung to it, or the storm of artillery that rained down around its walls daily. Whatever the reason, the greenskins surged toward the temple in force, day after day, eager to defile what they could not comprehend. Grimaldus had stationed himself there by design. While most of the Templars and the Steel Legion coordinated the defense of the wider hive, the Reclusiarch claimed the temple as his ground to hold, alone if need be. He called it his bastion of defiance. He told no one of the vow he had made before stepping through its massive gates, that it would not fall while he still drew breath. Upon entering the temple for the first time, Grimaldus removed his helm. He rarely did so. His skull-faced warplate had become his identity, a mask of divine judgment. But here, before the altar of the Emperor himself, he stood unveiled. The stained glass behind the dais depicted the master of mankind in radiant glory, his hands outstretched, his eyes burning with judgment. Grimaldus knelt before the altar and remained there for 3 hours in silence, surrounded by ash drifting through shattered windows. He offered no prayer. The prayer was in the blood he intended to spill defending it. He fortified the temple himself, walking its perimeter with his Cenobite servitors, dragging relic shrines behind him. He marked holy symbols upon the doors, blessed the battlements, and read aloud from the Book of Dorn to those defenders still manning the internal barricades. Civilians had taken shelter within the temple's lower sanctuaries, hundreds of them, drawn by desperation, wounded, starving, afraid. Grimaldus did not ask them to leave. He simply said, "If you are to die here, then die in the Emperor's shadow." and the people stayed. The first real assault came 2 days later. A mob of orcs, over 200 strong, breached the temple's outer gate using a looted mining rig turned into a makeshift battering ram. The explosion rocked the southern wall, and the swarm poured in like a flood of muscle and iron. Grimaldus met them at the transept steps, where stone gave way to sacred metal and fury met righteousness. He fought like a fury incarnate, no backup, no flanking fire, just the Reclusiarch alone, holding the line. The Crozius screamed through the air, each swing breaking bones and igniting corpses. His voice thundered scripture as he fought, calling down the Emperor's judgment with each step forward. The temple's defenders, guardsmen, PDF, even wounded civilians, rose from behind shattered pews and barricades to follow him. The oratory became a slaughterhouse, the nave littered with green corpses and shattered altarpieces. When the final orc fell, Grimaldus limped to the altar, blood soaking his armor, and placed a bolter shell on the Emperor's dais. A single act of tribute. The shell had been fired by a young guardsman, barely a man, who had died shielding a child. Grimaldus had seen it, remembered it. "You struck true," he whispered, placing the shell. "You are not forgotten." The temple became more than a stronghold after that. It became a symbol, a holy fortress. Every soul inside it became part of something greater. People began calling Grimaldus the voice of the temple, and rumors spread across the hive. The Reclusiarch guards the Emperor's house, and it still stands. But the pressure only mounted. Over the following week, the temple came under near-constant siege. Gargant artillery pummeled the outer walls, cracking statues and toppling buttresses. Orc commandos infiltrated through sewer channels, only to be caught in flame traps laid by the Templars. Rock ships crashed nearby, shaking the foundations and blowing out every stained glass window. Grimaldus slept for mere minutes at a time, resting only when the light outside turned the sky sulfur yellow, a signal of brief atmospheric stillness. Even then, he slept in his armor, bolter across his lap, Crozius still humming faintly. He held sermons each morning at the ruined pulpit, not just for Astartes, but for guardsmen and civilians alike. No ornate speech, no poetry, only truth. "You will die," he told them, "but you will not be erased. The Emperor remembers, and I will speak your names when he asks what stood at Helsreach." They stopped fearing death after that. Every assault became more frenzied. The orcs began constructing siege towers using the debris of fallen walkers and tanks. From atop these constructs, they launched themselves through the upper balconies, smashing stained glass icons and setting shrines aflame. Grimaldus responded with fury. When a flamer team was cut off in the eastern cloister, he crossed the courtyard alone to rescue them, wading through mobs of greenskins, dragging wounded soldiers back by the scruff of their armor. The last survivor, a woman missing her left leg, was carried over his shoulder as bolt shells exploded all around. He set her down before the main altar. "Now you've bled for the Emperor twice," he said. "Rest." She kissed the floor and passed out from blood loss. The temple continued to fall apart piece by piece. A spire collapsed after a gargant shell struck its base. Fires raged across the choir vaults, yet still the enemy could not breach the inner sanctum. Grimaldus would not allow it. On the 15th day, a massive orc warboss, encased in mega armor scavenged from fallen knights, led a renewed charge against the main gate. This was no raiding force. This was an attempt to shatter the temple once and for all. The walls buckled. The defenders faltered. Grimaldus activated the chapel's final defense, a cache of crack mines blessed by the Mechanicus and stored beneath the altar. When the warboss breached the final threshold, the mines detonated beneath his feet, blowing the gate and the invader into molten shards. When the smoke cleared, Grimaldus emerged, half his helmet sheared away, blood running down his temple, dragging the war boss's severed head behind him. He hung it from a rusted iron hook above the main gate. It remained there for the rest of the siege. By the end of the week, there were fewer than 50 defenders left alive inside the temple. Half of them could no longer stand. Ammunition was low, medical supplies were non-existent. Yet no one fled, no one begged. They were more than warriors now. They were the temple, and Grimaldus stood at their center, silent, black-armored, a monument unto himself. The temple of the Emperor Ascendant had not fallen. It would not fall, not while Merek Grimaldus still lived. There is a moment in every siege when hope dies, when the screams dull, when the guns fall silent for too long, and the living begin to wonder if they are simply waiting for the inevitable. For Helsreach, that moment came not with a thunderous charge or the roar of Gargant engines, but in the quiet, choking breath of smoke drifting through its heart. The temple of the Emperor Ascendant, once a beacon of resistance, stood broken. It had not fallen in battle. It had collapsed beneath its own defiance. The 22nd day of the siege began like all the others, with a low-pitched rumble beneath the hive's foundations and distant cries echoing through the spires. But there was something different in the air. The sky was strangely silent. No orc aircraft strafed the walls. No stompus fired their hellish payloads. The Iron Tide had withdrawn. Some thought the orcs were regrouping. Others believed they were preparing for a larger strike. But Grimaldus knew better. He felt it in the marrow of his armor, the same way a seasoned duelist senses the moment before the killing blow. The enemy had changed tactics, and he was right. Without warning, the orcs struck from below. For weeks they had been tunneling beneath the hive, not for infiltration, but for annihilation. Massive drilling rigs, reinforced with scavenged shield plating and powered by looted plasma cores, carved their way through the underhive. Sappers, mad, half-naked creatures wielding explosives fused with their own flesh, paved the tunnels with crude demolitions. And then they lit the fuse. The explosion beneath the temple was seismic. It cracked the foundations, split the floor of the central sanctum, and threw defenders into the air like broken dolls. Ancient columns collapsed, statues of saints tumbled and shattered. The high altar ruptured in a thunderclap of sacred dust. Fires ignited instantly, racing through the tunnels and incinerating anything combustible. Grimaldus had been in the reliquary vault when the detonation struck. He was thrown across the chamber, slamming into a column with enough force to dent his pauldrons. Rubble collapsed behind him, sealing the exit. Darkness swallowed the room. His first instinct was not pain nor confusion, but anger. The temple, his temple, had been defiled from beneath like a coward struck from the shadows. As he forced himself to his feet, blood running down his jaw, he saw the sacred reliquaries around him, crushed, buried, their contents lost in the collapse. He roared, not in pain, not in despair, but in a cry of defiance that shook dust from the vault's ceiling. It took him 4 hours to dig his way out, using the Crozius like a pick, carving through fallen stone and bent rebar with one arm half broken and his lungs filled with smoke. When he emerged, he found the nave choked in flame. The great stained glass windows had shattered, and fire danced through the shattered rafters like hungry spirits. Bodies were everywhere. Steel Legion soldiers, civilians, servitors, charred, buried, or dismembered by the force of the blast. His Cenobite servitors lay in pieces, their relics scattered among debris. Of the 50 defenders who had survived the last assault, fewer than a dozen still drew breath. Grimaldus did not speak. He moved through the ruin, one step at a time, dragging corpses from the flames, carrying broken limbs out of the smoke, searching for anything, anyone who could be saved. He pulled a wounded child from beneath a collapsed pew, found a guardsman still clutching his laser gun, trying to reload despite a shattered leg. Even then, in those ashes, duty did not die. He brought them together in what remained of the apes, those who could still move or still breathe. He laid them side by side, placing relics between them, smearing sacred oil across their foreheads with the last unbroken file he carried. And then he knelt among them, lowering his head. This was no sermon. This was mourning. I promised you this place would not fall, he said quietly. And still we are here. It burns, and still we are here. A guardsman tried to speak but coughed blood. Grimaldus placed a hand on his chest. Do not speak. You've already said more than the galaxy deserves. A whisper moved through the flames. Some say it was the Emperor's voice. Others claim it was the hallucination of smoke and trauma. But those present would later swear that the flames around them dimmed, that the fire bent away from the wounded, that the smoke cleared just long enough for them to see the shattered altar still standing. Grimaldus rose slowly. His armor was cracked, his crozius was scorched black, but his posture had not faltered. The orcs had not broken the temple, they had transformed it. What had once been a cathedral of imperial glory was now a shrine to sacrifice, a burned, broken ruin, but one still held, and that mattered more than any number of walls or vaults. He gathered what remained, 11 defenders able to stand. With them, he began the final purge. Orcs still swarmed the lower crypts. The tunnel that had brought the explosives had become a breach, pouring greenskins into the sanctuary. Grimaldus led the charge down those ruined steps, relics strapped to his back, his crozius pulsing with wrath. The tunnels ran red with orc blood. The narrow corridors favored the defenders. Flamers bathed the oncoming hordes in chemical fire. Frag grenades were rolled into choke points. Lass fire and bolt rounds turned the breach into a furnace of death. At the front, Grimaldus fought with neither grace nor restraint. He wielded the crozius with 2 hands, cracking skulls like ripe fruit, each blow followed by a prayer uttered between gritted teeth. He took wounds, deep ones. An orc cleaver bit into his thigh. A slug round shattered part of his shoulder guard. His gauntlet was torn open by a serrated blade. But he did not fall. In the depths of the catacombs, the last orc, a hulking knob painted in crude glyphs, charged at him in a fury. Grimaldus did not parry. He met the beast head-on, driving the crozius into its chest with a thunderclap that sent sparks exploding into the gloom. When it fell, the silence returned. The last breach had been sealed. The defenders dragged themselves back into the upper sanctuary, half-conscious, bleeding. Grimaldus followed last, collapsing beside the shattered altar. There, in the ashes, he remained for hours. No prayers, no victory cries, just silence. But across the vox net of Helsreach, a transmission broke through the static. The temple still stands. Those 4 words echoed through the hive like a miracle. It was not strategy, not firepower, not numbers. It was belief, held in the broken hands of a Reclusiarch who had refused to yield. Merek Grimaldus did not expect to survive the night, but he had kept his promise. The temple of the Emperor Ascendant had burned, but it had not fallen, and in the fires of ruin something stronger had risen from the ashes. In war, symbols matter more than banners or bullets. They are what hold men upright when their bones are broken, what drives a soldier to raise his weapon one final time, even as his blood drains into the dust. On Armageddon, amidst the choking smoke and the charred remains of 1,000 fallen defenders, one such symbol walked, not above them, but among them. His name was Merek Grimaldus, and after the temple's survival, the people of Helsreach no longer saw a chaplain. They saw a legend. The hive was dying. Fires tore through hab blocks. Toxic clouds roiled from ruptured promethium silos. Communications were patchy at best, jammed by orc scrap arrays or broken by sheer attrition. The void above was contested by orc rocks and fragmenting orbital stations. Every road, every corridor, every soul within the hive was under siege. But one message cut through the confusion. A phrase repeated over and over by Vox officers, civilians, and wounded soldiers alike. The Reclusiarch still lives. Grimaldus did not intend to become a myth. He never cared for glory or recognition. What mattered was the fight, the duty, and the Emperor's will made manifest through action. But Helsreach had changed him, not in purpose but in position. The temple had fallen and stood again, baptized in flame. And because he had stood with it, unbroken, something intangible had occurred. He became the voice for all those who no longer had one. The survivors of the temple clung to him, not physically. They were too disciplined, too reverent, but in the way they followed his every move. When he walked the ruined avenues, wounded soldiers stood straighter. Civilians bowed their heads. Children whispered prayers behind their hands. Grimaldus had never sought adoration, but now it shadowed him like a mantle too heavy to remove. He moved through the hive like a priest in a city of graves. Every street became his cathedral, every intersection his pulpit. He began holding sermons in the rubble, not by design, but because the people demanded them. After purging the last of the orc saboteurs from the temple crypts, Grimaldus and his dwindling retinue emerged to reinforce Sector 19, the Munitorum processing yards, where guardsmen had held out for 3 days without support. When Grimaldus arrived, they expected relief. What they received was fire. He strode into the trenches alone, raised his croziers high, and shouted scripture, not in quiet intonation, but in a voice that boomed across the entire district. Litanies of hate, prayers of judgment, blessings for the dead and damnation for the orcs. Even the enemy faltered, their charge slowing as they heard the fury in his words. It wasn't magic, it wasn't sorcery. It was conviction so absolute, so all-consuming, that even the ignorant beasts sensed its weight. The guardsmen surged behind him like a tide, bolters and lasguns roared in unison, chainswords revved. The defenders didn't merely repel the orcs, they annihilated them. And when the last greenskin fell, they didn't cheer. They turned to Grimaldus, weapons lowered, and simply listened as he walked the trenches, placing his hand on each of their shoulders in silent blessing. They began calling him the voice of the faithful. The name spread fast. By the 26th day of the siege, his presence had become a force multiplier. Units fought harder in sectors he visited. Civilians in shelters crafted crude effigies of him. Skull-helmed statues fashioned from scrap and bone, placed beside shrines to the Emperor. Chaplains across the wider crusade began receiving requests for sermons inspired by his words. Even commissars lowered their heads when he passed. But symbols draw attention, and not all of it was welcome. The orcs began to hunt him. Reports flooded in of greenskin warbands changing course, abandoning strategic objectives to march on his last known position. War bosses carved crude skull visors into their helmets, mocking his visage. Sniper nests were set up around Vox relays that had broadcast his voice. The Reclusiarch had become the enemy's favored prey. Grimaldus accepted this without pause. If the enemy wanted him, they would find him waiting. In response, he adopted a new pattern of movement. Every night, he relocated to a different battlefront, sometimes leading a Black Templar spearhead, other times walking alone into PDF redoubts to inspire the wounded. He became a phantom in the city, always arriving where the line was weakest, where faith flickered like a candle about to die. He never gave the same speech twice. To guardsmen, he spoke of duty, of how they, the so-called mortal and the disposable, were the Emperor's chosen hands upon the galaxy. To civilians, he whispered of dignity, that even in death their resistance would echo in eternity. To Astartes, he invoked Sigismund. He reminded them of the first vow, the crusade that never ended, and the legacy that bound their black armor tighter than any ceramite seal. But beneath all of this, beneath the fire and the fury, there was something else stirring in Grimaldus. Doubt, not in the Emperor, never in the faith, but in himself. He did not feel like a savior. He was tired, wounded, haunted by the weight of the dead. Every name he couldn't save was etched behind his eyes like script in fire. Every relic lost in the temple collapse clawed at his memory. He walked with purpose, but it was a purpose fueled not by pride, but by the crushing burden of expectation. He did not show it. Even when alone, helmet off, bloodied and bruised, he kept his posture. The people needed the myth. They needed to believe he was more than flesh and bone, and so he became it. One night, during a lull in the fighting, he sat with a child. The boy was no older than 10, curled in a bunker with his sister and 2 guardsmen who had been shielding them since the siege began. Grimaldus had been passing through on his way to reinforce the refinery line when the boy stopped him. "Are you really the last one from the temple?" he asked. Grimaldus knelt, setting his crozius beside him. "No," he said. "The temple still lives in everyone who stood." The boy nodded slowly, then looked toward the broken sky. "I heard the orcs are scared of you." Grimaldus picked up his weapon again and stood. "They should be." He left without another word, but that child's whisper followed him into battle. He's not just a space marine. He's a storm that prays. By the 30th day, Grimaldus was more than a Reclusiarch. He was a beacon, a curse to the orcs, a prayer given flesh for the defenders. The voice of the faithful marched through fire and ruin, and the city marched with him. Not because they thought he could save them, but because he made them believe they could save themselves. The war for Helsreach had stretched beyond the limits of maps or breath. Front lines shifted like sand dunes in a gale. Victory was measured in meters reclaimed and hours endured, not cities liberated. But war never remains isolated for long in the Imperium, and as Helsreach burned, the echo of its suffering called out to others, not all of them willing to ignore it. Among those who answered the call were warriors not clad in black, but in blue and gold, lion emblazoned and grim-eyed. The celestial lions had come to Armageddon, and they came broken. Grimaldus had known of them. Every Black Templar did. They were a once proud chapter, nearly annihilated after defying inquisitorial demands during the campaign on Armageddon's second front. The story had spread in whispered conversations between Astartes, wrapped in caution and shame. The lions had spoken truth and paid the price for it in blood. Their reinforcements had been ambushed repeatedly, their apothecaries assassinated, their numbers gutted by mysterious failures and accidents no one dared speak of too loudly. But now a fragment of them remained, and they had chosen to stand again, not for redemption, but for duty. Grimaldus first encountered them on the outskirts of Hive Grana, 300 kilometers east of Helsreach. He had been sent to assess the stability of the outer defense lines, what remained of them. Orc McGargans had smashed through the sector's wall days earlier, and scattered guard regiments were barely holding the rubble. He found the celestial lions in the ruins of a shrine, surrounded by 100 dead orcs and the bodies of their own. 7 remained, 7 warriors clad in scorched ceramite, bolters slick with dried blood, standing guard over the corpse of their fallen chaplain. They had held the line for 5 days without food, without Vox contact, and without orders. Not one of them had retreated. Not one had abandoned the shrine. They had simply endured. Grimaldus did not speak upon arrival. He dismounted from his rhino, walked through the ruins, and stood before the fallen chaplain. The lion's skull helm had been split down the middle. His hand still clutched a broken crozius. His chest bore 24 impact wounds. He had clearly died on his feet. The Reclusiarch knelt and placed his hand on the chaplain's shoulder. "Was he your last?" One of the lions nodded. "We remain to speak his oaths," the Astartes said, "until the last word is remembered." Grimaldus turned to face them. "Then speak them now." In the ash-choked wind, they recited the oaths of their fallen brother, his war vows, his litanies, his death prayer. They did not rush. They did not falter. Grimaldus listened to every word, memorized them, and when they were finished, he stepped forward and recited them again, word for word, voice steady. The lions stared in silence. "You are not forgotten," Grimaldus said at last. "He will live in your breath and your fire. You are his Cenobites now." He extended a hand. "Come with me. We have wars to fight." The 7 lions did not hesitate. They followed. For the first time since the temple's fall, Grimaldus was not alone in carrying the mantle of chaplaincy in the field. Though he remained the spiritual anchor of the Helsreach campaign, the presence of the celestial lions brought a weight he had not expected. Not just reinforcements, but fellow warriors of faith who had endured silence and betrayal, and yet still held their heads high. He learned their names: Dubaku, Seifu, Makonnen, Caleb, Osei, Theodros, and Jabari. They spoke little. They fought with restraint. But when they killed, it was with the fury of history demanding recompense. Dubaku became their voice, a sergeant in name, but a leader in truth. He and Grimaldus found an unlikely kinship. Both were orators. Both had buried too many brothers. Both had seen the corruption of institutions that claimed to be righteous, and had chosen to fight on regardless. During the push to reclaim Silo Block Epsilon, the Lions and Grimaldus led a combined assault. Templars, Lions, and Steel Legion elements. It was a furnace of steel, the corridors filled with burning promethium, and the stink of crushed orc flesh. But it was during that battle that a shift occurred. The lions did not just follow, they stood beside him. When Grimaldus charged into the breach, Dubaku matched his stride. When Grimaldus raised his voice in prayer, the lions echoed it with their own tongues, chanting oaths in ancient dialects, turning litanies into something that thundered through the ruins like drums of war. The men of the Steel Legion watched in awe. 2 chaplains, 2 worlds, 2 chapters divided by legacy, now unified by flame. It was a vision of what the Imperium could be. After the battle, Grimaldus gathered the lions in what remained of a manufactorum sub-chapel. There he brought forth a fragment of relic bone, taken from the temple of the Emperor Ascendant before its collapse. He offered it to Dubaku. "A gift," he said, "from one martyr to another." Dubaku took it with reverence, not because he needed it, but because he understood. In the days that followed, the lions moved with him from war zone to war zone. Their presence sent waves through the local command hierarchy. Questions were asked, some even whispered of unauthorized fraternization between chapters. Grimaldus silenced them with a single message to High Marshal Helbrecht. "I do not care for politics. These men bleed for the Emperor. That is enough." Helbrecht never responded, but no further objections came. The orcs responded in kind. Their warbands began forming up larger mobs, clearly recognizing the increased resistance. Mech boys deployed heavier walkers. Weird boys conjured warp energy that turned entire trenches inside out. But now, for every loss, there was unity. Faith did not falter. It multiplied. When the Greenskin push threatened to breach Supply Line 9, Grimaldus and the Lions led a nighttime counterattack under pitch-black skies. With only muzzle flashes to light the way, they cut through the orc ranks like divine executioners. In the aftermath, a guardsman, young, trembling, bloodied, asked Grimaldus if they were really space marines or something else. Grimaldus looked at him, then at the lions, their armor scorched, their helms dented but unbowed. "We are what happens when faith refuses to die." The boy never forgot that answer. Neither did the lions. Over time, they adopted parts of the Templars' liturgies. Grimaldus began integrating their death rites into his own sermons. It was not a merger of traditions, but a recognition, a mutual honor, two fractured legacies finding strength in shared suffering. For the first time since the temple burned, Grimaldus felt brotherhood again. Not command, not duty, but the quiet, sacred certainty that someone else bore the weight beside him. In a war where miracles were rationed like ammunition, that was perhaps the greatest gift of all. The brothers of the lions had come, and with them, Merek Grimaldus no longer stood alone. Death stalked every corridor of Helsreach. It did not wear the robes of mourning or move with solemn tread. It screamed from rusted engines, detonated in craters, and charged with roaring chain blades and tusked jaws. War had no end here. It was not a campaign, but a crucible, a prolonged trial by fire that melted faith down to its rawest ore. And in this furnace, one question hung heavier than any shell fire. Who would die first, Grimaldus or his belief? But Merek Grimaldus had never been one to ask for permission to live, nor did he ever wait to be told when to die. The moment that sealed this truth came during the 34th day of the siege in the shattered heart of Subsector Delta 9. A corridor of manufacture rooms and ammo dumps, once critical to Helsreach's armory, now lay buried beneath heaps of collapsed machinery and orc scrap. The few defenders stationed there had fallen back to the secondary hab structures. Untrained civilians, wounded Steel Legion troopers, and a handful of surviving Black Templars. Command had marked the area as a loss, but Grimaldus had not. He and the Celestial Lions were conducting a sweep through adjacent zones when the distress call came. A panicked Vox transmission, garbled and intermittent. "Orcs, inside the walls, can't hold. Evac failed. Civilians still. Emperor, protect us." Many on the channel assumed it was another ghost signal, echoes of a dead unit, or worse, a greenskin trick. Grimaldus did not. He ordered a turn. No votes, no discussion. Just a new heading transmitted via encrypted Vox to all attached units. The Black Templars and Celestial Lions moved in tandem, despite the clear risk. Reinforcements would not arrive. The sector had already been written off, and therein lay the problem. It wasn't just about saving the wounded. It was about defying the creeping voice that whispered to all Imperial defenders that some losses were acceptable, that some deaths were strategic. Grimaldus hated that voice more than he hated orcs. It was the voice of bureaucrats, of retreat, and it had no place in a city baptized in martyrdom. They arrived at dusk. Smoke thickened the air until the sun was nothing but a dull ember in the sky. What they found was worse than a massacre. It was a waiting room for execution. A crumbling hab complex, 7 stories tall, riddled with cracks and stained with blood. Inside, nearly 100 civilians huddled in silence, guarded by 6 wounded Legion troopers and 1 dying Astartes. Brother Arian of the Black Templars had held the line alone. His armor was in ruin, his chest plate half melted, his right pauldron gone, and his helm fused to the skin of his jaw by plasma burns. He knelt in the main hall of the hab unit, his chainsword still running, resting point down in the floor. His blood formed a halo around him, pooling at his knees. When Grimaldus entered, Arian turned his head, just enough to show 1 working eye. Recognition flared for a moment, then faded. "Reclusiarch," he rasped, "you shouldn't be here." Grimaldus approached in silence, the lions fanning out to secure the perimeter. He knelt before the dying warrior, laying a hand on his shoulder. "You held this ground." Arian's jaw twitched. "Held. Past tense. You did not break. I'm breaking now." Grimaldus removed his helm. He met the warrior's gaze without blinking. "Do you wish for last rites?" The question held weight. In the Reclusium, it was not asked lightly. Last rites were more than a benediction. They were a final severance from the mortal coil, a surrender of duty, a blessing to fall and pass the torch. Arian closed his eye. His lips trembled. Then he spoke with a voice like cracked granite. "No." Grimaldus did not move. "Explain." "I will not be released, not while they still live," Arian hissed, nodding toward the civilians. "If I die now, this place dies with me." Grimaldus stood. He looked toward the shattered entrance where the first sounds of orc war cries were already rising, getting closer. He turned back. "Then hold, and let me show you what defiance truly is." The orcs came in waves. First it was rock boys, green lunatics launched from crude cannons embedded in scrap tanks, hurling themselves into walls and through windows. Then came the storm boys, jetpack-wearing savages, screaming praises to speed and fire. Finally, the real hammer, a wave of armored knobs backed by looted walkers, stomping through the alleyways like walking siege engines. Grimaldus met them at the threshold. With Dubaku at his right and Templar Sergeant Callan at his left, they formed a shield wall of ceramite and faith. Bolters roared. Frag grenades turned alleys into clouds of red mist. Flamers swept from window to window, burning orcs mid-leap. But it was Grimaldus who held the center. He planted the haft of his Crozius in the dirt like a war banner and bellowed a single command. "Stand." And they did. Even the wounded, even the civilians. They stood behind the wall of Astartes, some wielding pipes, others broken lace guns. A priest missing half his face recited the catechism of enduring fire until his voice gave out. A mother with a burnt arm carried water to the lines until she collapsed from exhaustion. No one fled. The first knob reached the front and met the Crozius. Grimaldus struck with such force that the orc's head exploded in a shower of bone and molten iron. He pivoted without pause, catching a storm boy mid-dive and driving him through a rusted support pillar. Every motion was purposeful, efficient, controlled. Not a single blow wasted. Behind him, Brother Arian tried to rise. He fell once, twice. On the third try, he stood. He joined the line. Grimaldus did not look back. He did not need to. The fighting lasted 7 hours. The orcs did not stop, not until their dead clogged the alleys and their wounded howled retreat. By the end, the walls were pockmarked ruins, the floors ankle-deep in brass casings and blood. But the line held, and Arian lived. Barely. When dawn broke, Grimaldus once again knelt before him, offering the rites. This time, Arian accepted, but not because he had surrendered, because he had earned them. Grimaldus poured sacred oil upon his brow, reciting the final litany. "Go now to the Golden Hall, stand before Dorn, let him see you bore the weight until the final breath." Arian died smiling. The civilians wept openly, and Grimaldus, helm returned, turned to face them. "You were marked for death," he said. "The orcs saw only prey, but you stood. And because of that, I say this. You are now Crusaders." They saluted as best they could. When the evacuation column arrived, the civilians were escorted out, one by one. Before boarding, many touched the cracked wall where Grimaldus had stood. Some took scrap shrapnel from the site, turning it into crude medallions. Others simply whispered thanks. Grimaldus did not stay to receive them. He was already marching toward the next fire, because there would be no rest, and because sometimes refusing the last rites is the greatest prayer of all. There was a place in Helsreach where even the steel remembered pain, a stretch of industrial wasteland so torn by constant war that the earth itself had fractured into glassy fissures and slag-laced ravines. The air there burned with residual promethium, and the echoes of battles past never quite faded. This place, once known as Mannheim Gap, had become a graveyard of war machines, Lehman Rust tanks half submerged in molten wreckage, Orc trucks fused to collapsed refineries, and Astartes rhino hulls riddled with so many craters they resembled bone. It was also the gateway to the city's last standing promethium reserves. If the Orcs took it, the hive would choke. The defenders of Helsreach could not afford another loss. Not after so many fallen sectors, not after the collapse of the temple, not after the 1,000 daily reminders that faith alone did not fuel artillery. Without promethium, the city's tanks would sit silent, its flamers would run dry, its final hopes would smolder into silence. The Orcs understood this in their own crude way. Their mechs, their war bosses, their savage intellects, driven more by instinct than doctrine, had targeted Mannheim, not because it was strategic in the imperial sense, but because they smelled its value in fire and fuel. If they took the gap, they would set the entire hive ablaze from beneath. And standing between them and that final desecration was Merek Grimaldus and the last crusading remnants of the Black Templars and the Celestial Lions. The Reclusiarch arrived at Mannheim on the morning of the 37th day of the siege. Smoke coiled across the plain in lazy spirals, revealing towering chimneys and half-collapsed promethium silos. The land had already suffered weeks of artillery strikes, and the Orcs had constructed makeshift trenches across the northern approach. Their war banners fluttered like infected wounds, crude glyphs daubed in blood and ash. Grimaldus stood atop the command bastion, surveying the ruins. Beside him stood Dubaku, the voice of the Celestial Lions, his blue and gold armor stained with the black grime of constant battle. Neither spoke for a time. They didn't need to. What lay ahead was obvious. The final battle for Mannheim had begun. Grimaldus turned to his brothers. 100 Astartes remained in a fighting condition, half Templars, half Lions, all battle-scarred, all grim-eyed. With them were 2 Steel Legion companies, 5 tanks, and an artillery battery held together by desperation and duct tape. Behind them, huddled near the refinery walls, were thousands of exhausted workers, Medicaya personnel, and surviving PDF, non-combatants caught in the crossfire with nowhere left to run. Grimaldus did not waste time with a grand speech. Instead, he activated his helm vox and broadcast his voice to the entire sector. Brothers, warriors, mortals of the Emperor, you stand at the edge of annihilation. Beyond that line is not just the enemy. It is the end of your children, your homes, your hive. We will not yield this ground, not 1 foot, not 1 heartbeat. He turned to the lions beside him. And when the histories forget our names, the roar we leave here will remain. With that, he gave the order. They attacked at dawn. It was a strategy both daring and savage. Deny the Orcs the initiative. Hit them before their siege lines were complete. Storm the trenches. Take their weapons and turn them on their masters. Force them into disorder. It was the kind of attack that commanders 10 ranks above would have called madness. But Grimaldus understood war in ways the living never could. He didn't care for elegance. He needed fury, shock, faith weaponized into momentum. The Templars charged first, bolters blazing, chanting litanies through gritted teeth. Lions followed in tight formations, placing their fire with surgical precision. Behind them, tanks thundered forward, crushing debris and greenskins alike. The promethium flowed freely in Mannheim. The air caught fire almost instantly. Dubaku fought like a soul unleashed, his blade cleaved through orc knobs as if guided by divine vengeance. At one point, he vaulted over a wrecked chimera and landed in the midst of 5 storm boys mid-jet burst. 3 were dead before they touched ground. The remaining 2 never had the chance to scream. Grimaldus, for his part, was a storm made flesh. He moved through the trenches like a holy executioner, his crozius arcing with golden energy. Every swing broke bone and faith. His voice roared across the Vox, every word a sermon, every breath a litany of wrath. But the orcs were not idle. A great war boss, Grolgut's Bloodmaw, rallied the greenskin horde. A colossus of meat and iron, draped in chains and wielding a power claw the size of a sentinel's cockpit, he emerged from the back lines like a walking tank. His arrival turned the tide. The orcs roared in unison and pushed back with brutal strength. The Imperial line began to crack. Steel Legion tanks were immobilized. Infantry was forced to retreat into the ruins of the processing yards. Dubaku was knocked from his feet by a thunderous shell that shattered a supporting tower. For a moment, it seemed the line would break, until Grimaldus climbed atop a shattered war truck, raised the crozius, and screamed. It wasn't a speech. It was a single word. Now. The Templars rallied instantly. Lions rose from the rubble like revenants. Even the wounded PDF surged forward. They charged not just at the enemy, but toward Grimaldus, following the sound of his voice like pilgrims chasing salvation. Grimaldus met Bloodmaw head-on. The war boss laughed, a booming guttural sound that echoed like tank fire. He swung his claw in a lazy arc, enough to pulverize a dreadnought. Grimaldus ducked beneath it, drove his crozius into the beast's side, and tore backward, splitting armor and flesh. Bloodmaw howled and swung again, this time connecting, slamming Grimaldus through a stack of promethium drums. They exploded. Flames engulfed the war zone. For seconds, nothing moved. Then, through the wall of smoke, Grimaldus walked. On fire. His armor was ablaze, blackened and sparking, but he didn't falter. He walked straight into the war boss's path and kept swinging. The final blow cracked Bloodmaw's skull in half, spraying blood across the sands of Mannheim. Silence followed. Then the orcs broke. Without their war boss, their charge dissolved into chaos. Some fled. Some stood in confusion, and others simply died, caught in the renewed fury of the counterattack. By nightfall, the trenches belonged to the Imperium again. The lion had roared, and the enemy had been silenced. In the aftermath, Grimaldus stood atop the ramparts of the refinery, overlooking the battlefield. Dubaku joined him, his helm removed, his face cut and bloodied, but defiant. Grimaldus did not speak. Dubaku did. "You said we would not be remembered," he said quietly. "But this roar, this one will never fade." Grimaldus looked out at the shattered battlefield, at the pyres being built, at the banners rising once more from the ruins, at the wounded being carried with reverence. He finally replied, "Number it won't." The siege of the Mannheim Gap had ended, and from its ashes a new echo began to spread, one born not of command or creed, but of unity, of sacrifice, and of a lion's roar answering a Reclusiarch's flame. After the Mannheim Gap fell silent, a strange hush swept across the war-torn bones of Helsreach, not the peace of victory, but the tension of survival. The kind of silence that follows a scream. Ash clung to the air like a second skin. Shellfire ceased only briefly. But in that fragile breath between battles, something far older stirred in the depths of Merek Grimaldus's mind, something not born of faith or flame, but of memory. He stood atop a fractured spire overlooking the battlefield, his armor scorched black, his crozius resting across one shoulder like a relic too heavy for mortal hands. Below, the wounded were being dragged into the rubble shelters. Templar medici moved among them in silence. Dubaku was gone. Not dead. Missing. He had been last seen pursuing retreating orcs into the tunnel network beneath the Mannheim refinery, a grim smile etched across his blood-streaked helm. His brothers had begged Grimaldus to authorize reinforcements. The Reclusiarch had refused. Dubaku went to reclaim more than just a tunnel, he had said. He went to reclaim honor. Hours passed, smoke thickened, and still no word. Then, long past midnight, the Vox crackled with a single transmission. "I have found them." It was Dubaku's voice, but it carried a weight not there before, a presence that Grimaldus recognized immediately. It was the sound of something reclaimed, something once lost, now reforged. The Reclusiarch wasted no time. He and a small strike force descended into the refinery's sublevels, winding stairwells of rusted iron and gantries choked with green blood and soot. The deeper they went, the more warped the architecture became, twisted by years of neglect and greenskin infestation. Orc glyphs glowed faintly on the walls, daubed in crude oils. The stink of mold and blood clung to everything. Then they found the chamber. It had once been a Mechanicus vault, a maintenance shrine for the refinery's sacred engines. But now it was a battlefield. Dozens of orc corpses littered the floor, limbs scattered like broken machinery. Their deaths were not clean. They had been torn apart in fury. At the center of the room stood Dubaku. He was on one knee, surrounded by 7 fallen celestial lions. Not new casualties, old ones, each clad in ancient, cracked armor, their chapter markings faded but recognizable. Some had been dead for weeks, others for years. One still clutched a rusted bolt pistol in skeletal fingers. They were the lost, the forgotten, the ones struck down in campaigns the Imperium had tried to erase. Dubaku had brought them here, or rather, he had found them here. "Tell me," Grimaldus said, voice low as he stepped into the chamber. "What is this place?" Dubaku stood. He turned slowly, his golden helm reflecting the flickering lumen light. "This was where they were left," he said. "After the ambushes, after the denials, after the silence. These halls were meant to bury the truth." Grimaldus looked at the bodies, then at Dubaku. "They died as warriors." "They died alone," Dubaku growled. A long silence passed between them. Grimaldus broke it. "Not anymore." He knelt before one of the fallen, his gauntlet brushing aside grime to reveal a purity seal still half intact. He recited the canticle of fallen brothers, a rite so old even most Templars had forgotten its full form. Behind him, the other Astartes joined in. Their voices echoed through the vault, deep and resonant. Dubaku did not kneel. He removed his helm. And for the first time, Grimaldus saw tears running down the man's face, not of grief, but of release. "I carried this weight for too long," Dubaku whispered. "The shame, the loss, the silence forced upon us." "You don't carry it anymore," Grimaldus said. "We carry it together." They burned the bodies that night, not with flame but with light. Plasma coils and sanctified thermite turned into a pyre of searing brilliance. As the vault lit up, shadows danced across the walls. The heat forced everyone back, except Dubaku. He remained close, bathed in the glow, eyes locked on the fire as if watching ghosts ascend. From that moment onward, something changed. He no longer walked beside Grimaldus as a comrade, but as an equal. His voice grew stronger in the Vox liturgies. His leadership became undeniable among the lions. Wherever he went, the air seemed to still, like a man who had faced the worst and emerged not unscathed but unshaken. Warriors followed him without command. His name was spoken with reverence. The celestial lions had found more than a battlefield. They had found a leader reborn. Grimaldus recognized the signs. He saw it in Dubaku's stance, in the way he addressed the wounded, in the fire behind his words. The lions had been broken, but no longer. Dubaku had taken the pieces of his chapter's disgrace and reforged them into a new blade, and now it was ready to be wielded again. In a private moment before dawn, Grimaldus called him aside. "You are more than a brother to your chapter," he said. "You are its fire." "I am only one among many," Dubaku replied. "No," Grimaldus said. "You are the one who stayed, who stood, and who returned. That is what a chapter master is." Dubaku did not answer, but he did not argue. The next day, the Celestial Lions formally declared Ekene Dubaku their new leader. It was not a ceremony, it was a truth made manifest. No fanfare, no banners, just warriors acknowledging what had already happened in spirit. Grimaldus stood at his side as the declaration was made. They clasped wrists, not as warriors bound by temporary alliance, but as equals, as relics of forgotten battles and voices long denied. "You are the pride of your chapter," Grimaldus said. Dubaku smiled faintly. "And you are its memory." Together they turned to face the dying hive, and once more they marched. The rebirth of the Celestial Lions was not sung in hymn or etched in marble. It was written in the blood beneath Mannheim, in the vaults no longer hidden, in the fire of warriors who refused to vanish. And in the days to come, when Helsreach trembled under its final trials, it would not face them alone. It would have a voice of flame. And now it would also have a roar. It is one thing to fight the orcs. It is another to hunt their god-touched prophet. For weeks, Helsreach had been consumed by attrition. Trenches were dug, burned, and rebuilt. Streets turned into rivers of blood. Every battle had a rhythm, one that danced to the insane pulse of orc momentum and imperial resistance. But somewhere behind the smoke, behind the endless tide of green, there loomed a greater shadow. A warlord whose name burned hotter than any Prometheum. Gazkul Mag Uruk Thraka, the architect of the Wa, the herald of Armageddon's apocalypse, the beast whose voice could bend the will of millions and whose ambitions reached beyond stars. Every orc fought harder because they believed in him, and every imperial defender bled more deeply because they knew he had not yet struck. Grimaldus had been waiting for him. The Reclusiarch did not speak the warlord's name often. He considered it a corruption, a distortion of purpose. Names, he believed, carried weight, and some should be silenced by fire, not echoed in reverence. But he knew that as long as Thraka remained at large, the siege would never truly end. The orcs would continue to feed on his ambition, his madness, his purpose. So when the reports came in, fragments of Vox-scrambled data, aerial scans, and intercepted orc chatter, Grimaldus did not hesitate. A warband had been sighted at the edge of Helsreach's no-man's land, led by a massive greenskin in black mega armor, towering over even the orc knobs around him. The scans were hazy, distorted by the ash-choked sky, but the silhouette was unmistakable. Thraka had come to Helsreach, or so it seemed. Grimaldus gathered his forces with surgical precision. No grand crusade, no wide-scale maneuver, just a strike force. Black Templars, Celestial Lions, and Steel Legion veterans, those who had survived the worst and still stepped forward. Among them were Dubaku, now leading his reborn lions with quiet fury, and Sergeant Callan, one of the last remaining sword brothers, still at Grimaldus's side. Their mission was simple: pursue, confirm, kill. They deployed via rhino transports under cover of an ash storm, riding low through the broken terrain that had once been Armageddon's industrial belt. Everything was slagged, twisted steel, ruptured pipelines, and shattered towers that leaned like the bones of some fallen god. The sky wept soot. Auspec's scans were unreliable. They followed tracks in the dirt, massive footprints, torn wreckage, and the stink of orc oil. Hours passed. The storm thickened. Then, at the edge of a collapsed fuel processing complex, they found the warband, or rather, the wreckage of one. Bodies were everywhere, orc corpses hacked apart with savage fury. Vehicles had been torn open, not by melter fire, but by something brutal and close range. Giant craters marked the ground, and there, in the center, was a severed orc head, massive, tusked, and still steaming. It wore Thraka's war paint. Grimaldus stared at it for a long time. "It's a double," Dubaku said. "A bodyguard disguised." Grimaldus didn't respond. He moved through the wreckage slowly, inspecting the remains. The pattern was familiar. It wasn't chaos, it was purpose. The orcs hadn't been ambushed by Imperial forces. They'd been punished by their own. This wasn't a battlefield, it was a message. Suddenly, the vox clicked, a shriek of static, followed by a low, guttural voice. Scrambled, but clear enough. "You can chase me, Skullhead, but you'll never catch me." Grimaldus froze, then it repeated. I see your fire, but your flame's just a candle, mine's a storm." It ended. There was no trace of the source, no signal trail, just the echo of the warlord's laughter fading into the storm. Grimaldus's gauntlet tightened around his Crozius. He had expected a fight. Instead, he found a challenge. Thraka had baited him. More than that, he understood Grimaldus. Understood enough to know the power of a symbol, the weight of an icon. This wasn't just a retreat, it was psychological warfare. The warlord had reached into the core of the Templars' doctrine and dared him to follow. The Reclusiarch turned to his warriors. "Burn the dead," he ordered. "Clean the field, and prepare to move." "Move where?" Callan asked. Grimaldus looked toward the horizon, toward the jagged line of mountains that marked the edge of the battlefront, a region known as the Sorrow Spires, where orc warbands were rumored to be staging new offensives. "There," Dubaku stepped forward. "You know this is a trap." Grimaldus nodded once. "And I will walk into it with eyes open, because he thinks himself unchallenged, uncatchable, untouchable." He placed his Crozius across his shoulder again. "Let's teach him otherwise." They moved at dusk. The terrain worsened as they entered the spires, jagged, unstable, haunted by orc sentries and buried explosives. Skirmishes erupted every hour, ambushes, mobs, false trails. The orcs fought harder here, not like the wild berserkers they usually were, but with coordination, timing, as if protecting something deeper in the mountain. Then, on the 39th day of the siege, they found it. A war camp, massive in scale, tucked into a canyon wreathed in smoke and lit by pyres of burning scrap. Dozens of mechs toiled at repair bays, grot slaves hauled ammunition. Tanks, real ones looted and repurposed, lined the cliffs like watchful beasts. At the center stood a fortress of scrap metal and bone, emblazoned with a crude symbol. A flaming skull impaled on a spike. Thraka's symbol. But he wasn't there, only a recording. Activated the moment Grimaldus crossed the threshold. "Still chasing ghosts, Humie?" "Good. Keep chasing. We'll see if your little black cross still shines when the stars go out." The fortress exploded. Charges had been set throughout the camp. The orcs detonated their own stronghold rather than let it fall. The entire canyon lit up in a chain reaction of fire and shrapnel, throwing Grimaldus and his warriors back through the smoke. When he rose, his armor was scorched, one lens of his helm cracked. But he stood, and he laughed, not out of joy, out of understanding. Ghazghkull had no intention of defeating Grimaldus in battle, not yet. He wanted to break him first, to make the Reclusiarch doubt himself, to prove that his fire, however fierce, could not reach far enough to burn a god of the Wa. But Ghazghkull had made a mistake. He had assumed that Grimaldus needed to win. He didn't. He just needed to endure. Because unlike the Orc prophet, Grimaldus didn't crave glory. He craved justice, and he would follow the beast across the stars to deliver it, if necessary. For now, the warlord had fled, but the city still stood, and Grimaldus, once again, had walked through fire without breaking. The chase had only begun. The fires of Helsreach still raged, though the front line had begun to fracture under the weight of attrition and stubborn resistance. The air carried a stench of promethium and ozone, burned flesh mixed with burnt earth. Victory, if it existed at all, was counted in inches, scraped from the soil by broken bayonets and splintered bolt guns. But for Merek Grimaldus, something deeper had begun to shift. The war was still real, still personal, still soaked in fury and faith. Yet he felt it in the Vox traffic, in the battle reports streaming across encrypted Imperial channels. The wider galaxy was changing. The Eye of Terror had ruptured. Cadia was gone. The Cicatrix Maledictum had torn the Imperium in two. The storms of the warp boiled across the stars, and with them had come the Primaris. Bigger, stronger, born in secret vaults on Mars, bearing armor and weaponry refined beyond what Grimaldus had known. Reinforcements arrived with them. New space marines delivered across the Great Rift, deployed by Guilliman's own hand. They called it the Indomitus Crusade. To many, it was salvation. To Grimaldus, it was an earthquake beneath the foundations of everything he believed. He met them first in the form of a thunderhawk arriving under fire. The war for Helsreach had reached a momentary lull, a pause in the slaughter between Orc warbands regrouping and Imperial lines holding firm. Into this smog-thick calm, the sleek gunship landed near a fortified bastion at the edge of the refinery fields. Its hull bore the fresh sigils of the Ultima founding. Blue armor, gold trim, a purity in design that contrasted with the charred brutality around it. The primaries disembarked in silence, 10 of them, led by a tall figure clad in burnished black and bone, marked with the livery of the Black Templars. Their helms were sleek, their frames massive. They moved with mechanical grace, but without the weathered scars of decades in the field. They looked like statues, not warriors. Grimaldus was there waiting. He stood atop the bastion wall, arms folded, helmet removed. The air crackled between him and the newcomers. The lead Primaris stepped forward and removed his helm. "I am brother Captain Tarsidian, newly assigned from the Crusade fleets. I bear orders from the High Marshal." Grimaldus did not return the greeting. "You were not forged among us," he said coldly. "You do not know our creed, our trials, our wars. What makes you Templars?" Tarsidion's expression did not change. "I was not born among you, but I bled for your standard at Harrowgate Reach. I lost half my company driving the Greenskins from the Iron Plains of Devria. And I've come here not for glory, but because I heard your city was burning, and I refused to let it burn alone." There was silence. The wind howled through broken Vox towers. A gust lifted black ash from the ground. Then Grimaldus descended the rampart stairs and walked directly to him. He studied the Primaris up close, his size, his armor, the foreign seal locks, and the strange, clean scent of unblemished ceramite. A body unweathered by time, a face unlined by decades of sacrifice. "You look like one of us," he said, "but looks mean nothing." Tarsidian met his gaze. "Then test me." Grimaldus turned his back. "Good, because the orcs are regrouping at the eastern gate, and I intend to break them before they breathe again." The newcomers joined the fight without question. In the hours that followed, the eastern trench line became the proving ground. Tarsidion and his squad deployed alongside veteran Templars and Steel Legion gunners, reinforced the barricades, and weathered a renewed orc charge that shattered 2 tank regiments and buried entire bunkers. Grimaldus led from the center. He watched how the Primaris fought. They were different. Their blows were heavier. Their aim was unnervingly precise. They advanced with coordinated discipline, not the raw fury of traditional Templars. And yet, when a squad of burner boys breached the left flank, Tarsidian threw himself into the breach without hesitation, shielding a wounded neophyte and taking a power axe to the chest plate before decapitating the orc in return. Grimaldus pulled him from the rubble. "You're not dead." Tarsidian, coughing blood, replied, "Then I'm not done." That night, the line held, and Grimaldus knew the truth. These warriors were not his brothers, but they were something more dangerous. They were needed. Still, acceptance did not come easily. After the battle, as Merek tended the wounded and Tech Marines dragged ruined armor from the kill zone, Grimaldus sat alone within a makeshift reliquary bunker. Before him lay a cracked statue of the Emperor, salvaged from a fallen cathedral. He stared into the hollow eye sockets of the stone face. "This is not what I was trained to trust," he said aloud. The door opened behind him. It was Dubaku. He stepped forward and placed a relic down beside the statue, a purity seal, blackened and torn. "One of the Primaris fell today," he said. "Held the pass long enough for us to collapse the bridge, died with your name on his lips." Grimaldus looked up slowly. "He didn't know me." "No," Dubaku said, "but he believed in you." Grimaldus didn't reply. He didn't need to. The next morning he gathered the Primaris before the chapel. He held a relic of Sigismund aloft, a broken chain from the first High Marshal's armor. Scorched, ancient and revered. He looked at the new warriors, towering, silent, waiting for rejection or recognition. He gave them neither. Instead, he said, "You are not ours, not yet. But this war does not allow time for ceremony. If you bleed for the cross, then you will wear it. If you endure what we endure, then you will be brothers." He lowered the relic. "But know this, faith is not in your veins. It is in your will. You are not Templars because the High Marshal says so. You are Templars only when you choose to be." They saluted him with iron silence. The Primaris had crossed the Rubicon, but now it was Grimaldus who would have to cross his own. In the days that followed, the new warriors became part of his command structure. Tarsidian fought beside him at the shield breaker wall. Another Primaris sergeant gave his life protecting Grimaldus from a weird boy's psychic detonation. Their blood spilled across the same soil. Their dead were added to the same prayers. The Black Templars did not change, but they grew. And for the first time, Merek Grimaldus looked at the future, not with dread, but with challenge, because he knew the truth. The fire would burn long after he was gone, so long as there were those willing to carry it into the dark. The Primaris were here, the Rubicon was behind them, and now the next war awaited. When the sky cracked, no one knew if it was the end or the beginning. On the 44th day of the siege, the heavens above Helsreach split open with the brilliance of warp-choked lightning. A rift, not quite as large as the one seen in the distant Cicatrix Maledictum, but enough to paint the horizon in fire and dread, opened above the outer atmosphere of Armageddon. The light was unnatural, hues that did not belong to mortal eyes. It illuminated every broken building, every cratered road, every charred cathedral with a ghostly glow. The defenders of the hive froze. Guardsmen stumbled from trenches, weapons lowered, their eyes wide in horror or awe. Vox chatter crackled with static and superstition. Some cried out that the Emperor had returned. Others feared the warp had come to devour them whole. Even the orcs paused their bloodlust for a moment, watching the sky with confusion, as if uncertain whether this storm belonged to them. But Merek Grimaldus, he did not look up. He stood in the ruins of a Prometheum depot, hands wrapped around the haft of his crozius, blood dried across his armor, his helm hanging at his belt. He had seen too many lies written in fire. Instead, he turned his gaze to the ground, to what was real, to what was his. A courier from the outer defense lines arrived on a bike, half consumed by rust and battle damage. The rider was barely conscious, helmet dented, one eye missing. "Reclusiarch," he rasped, dismounting and collapsing to one knee. They're saying it's the Great Rift. It's finally reached us." Grimaldus stepped forward, lifted the man effortlessly, and looked into his face. "We have survived worse than storms." "But this isn't just a storm," the courier said. "The fleet in orbit, our reinforcements, they've gone dark. No communications, no movement. As if they were swallowed whole," Grimaldus asked. The man nodded. Grimaldus handed him a flask of recycled water, tapped the side of his cracked pauldron, and sent him back toward the command trench. When he turned again to the battlefield, Dubaku stood there, silent, gold and blue armor caked in soot, helm off, face grim. "You feel it, don't you?" he said quietly. Grimaldus nodded. "The warp is bleeding through." Dubaku looked to the sky, then to the streets. "And yet the orcs have not changed. They still kill, still burn. Because they are too stupid to fear what they do not understand," Grimaldus replied. "Or too pure in their hatred." Grimaldus tilted his head slightly. "Purity in hatred is not a compliment." But the storm above was more than just a change in weather. It was a sign. The Dark Imperium had arrived, not merely in maps or borders, but in presence, in Armageddon's soil. The warp had touched the world, even if only briefly, and that touch would linger. Over the next days, communications across the surface collapsed into chaos. Vox beacons that had worked for decades screamed with incoherent whispers. The light in the sky disrupted cogitator systems, causing sentry turrets to malfunction and servitors to seize. Supplies arriving from orbit went missing. A transport of desperately needed medical aid dropped directly into Orc-controlled territory, its beacon transmitting a death dirge before going silent forever. But worse still were the dreams. The Psychers, of course, broke first. Astropaths clawed at their own faces, babbling visions of black suns and angels screaming in chains. Even some hardened guardsmen began waking in cold sweats, haunted by images of thrones cracking and golden giants drowning in blood. And in the center of it all, Grimaldus. He did not sleep, he did not dream, but he felt the tension in every breath of his warriors. Some of the Primaris, untested by the long dark of millennia, began to question the signs. Were they forsaken? Was this truly the Imperium's final dusk? Grimaldus called them together. Not just the Black Templars, but the Lions, the Steel Legion remnants, the civilians still carrying weapons they barely understood. He stood atop the steps of the ruined courthouse, now nothing more than rubble and fractured pillars. The sky above him still bled purple and green, and he spoke. "You look to the heavens, and you see death." He pointed to the rift, now flickering like an open wound. "You see this, and believe it to be the end, that the Emperor has turned from us, that we are lost, that our efforts mean nothing." He raised his crozius, the head of the weapon crackling faintly with sacred energy. "But I say this. The Emperor did not die for perfect victories. He did not send us forth so we could win every battle. He sent us to endure, to deny, to say no to every god, every daemon, every false miracle that tries to unmake his domain." He stepped down into the crowd. "Look around you. We have not won this war, but we are still here. You have bled. You have burned. You have seen your gods fall silent and your commanders buried under rubble, but you still stand." His voice rose to a roar. "And that is victory. Even the wounded lifted their heads. "You want to fear the rift?" Grimaldus asked. "Then fear what it has already tried to take and failed. It could not take your spirit, it could not take your defiance, and it will not take this city." The Vox recording of that speech would be transmitted across the entire hive. It would outlast the war. But speeches alone do not hold lines. Within hours of the oration, the orcs attacked again, more savage than before. Whether driven by the rift's influence or simply maddened by their own bloodlust, they surged from the ash fields in mobs so large they blotted out the remains of the sun. The outer walls collapsed. The gates were overrun. The final phase of the siege had begun, and Grimaldus met it head-on. He fought like a warrior possessed, though he would never admit to anything beyond grim determination. He led charges into firestorms. He pulled wounded from the wreckage with one hand and struck down knobs with the other. His voice rallied battalions that should have broken. Tarsidian, the Primaris captain, fought beside him. Dubaku held the left flank. Callan died covering a bridge with 3 surviving Templars, their bodies forming a wall that held back 2 trucks and an entire squad of Stormboys. By the time the orcs reached the inner sanctum, there were less than 1,000 defenders left alive. But the flag still flew, the Aquila still burned above the spire, and Grimaldus still stood. In the final moments of the assault, with the rift still bleeding light across the heavens, he climbed the remains of a Prometheum tower and sent a single Vox message to every Imperial channel still open. "The sky is broken, but we are not." Armageddon had changed, the galaxy had changed, but Merek Grimaldus, Reclusiarch of the Black Templars, had endured it. And as the dark Imperium settled like a shroud across the stars, he made a vow not to retreat, not to rebuild, but to carry this war into every shadow that dared reach for humanity's flame. The new dawn was dark, but he would burn all the brighter. In the ashes of Helsreach, where walls had become tombstones and the sky no longer promised dawn, a strange thing began to happen. Amidst the cratered ruins and shattered cathedrals, amongst the broken shelters and rusted shrines, people began to speak of Merek Grimaldus, not as a man, but as something more. At first it was only whispers, wounded guardsmen speaking in hushed tones around flickering lumen lamps. Civilians clutching relics fashioned from battlefield scrap, murmuring prayers not to the Emperor, but through the Reclusiarch. They didn't call it heresy. They didn't mean blasphemy. They simply didn't know what else to cling to. Because when the Vox Towers failed, when the officers died, when the sky bled and the walls collapsed, he remained. He had walked through fire that melted tank armor. He had stood unmoved as buildings fell around him. He had delivered sermons with a cracked voice and blood running down his brow. He had refused death again and again, even when all logic said he should be a corpse buried beneath steel and ash. And in this shattered city, where belief itself had splintered, faith reshaped itself around him. They began calling themselves the Cult of the Unbroken. Grimaldus didn't learn of them through doctrine or formal complaint. He felt them first, noticed the way civilians gathered in tighter formations when he passed. Not just with respect, but reverence. He saw scraps of parchment bearing his likeness, crude sketches etched into the walls of chapels. Some bore inscriptions, the voice that endured, the hammer that did not break, he who watched while the sky fell. It unnerved him. When a Mediki approached him in the lower manufactorum, kneeling and asking for his blessing to sanctify a burn victim in his name, Grimaldus refused. When a wounded preacher gave him a vial of water and called it holy because it passed your lips, Grimaldus shattered the vial against the wall. "Only the Emperor is divine," he growled. "I am only a weapon." But the cult did not stop. Like weeds growing between bones, it rooted in despair and bloomed in war. Dubaku was the first to confront him about it directly. They met in the ruins of the Temple of the Golden Vault, a former bank-turned fortress, now hollowed out and lined with banners stitched from uniforms and flak jackets. It was a place of memorial now, not strategy. A quiet spot, as close to peace as Helsreach could offer. Dubaku stood before a wall where prayers had been written in soot and dried blood. Many were scrawled in High Gothic, others in broken Low Gothic. Some were childlike, others written with trembling hands. But they all bore one name, Grimaldus. "I thought you should see this," Dubaku said. "They come here every day, some to pray, some to weep, some to listen. They wait hours just to see you pass." Grimaldus approached the wall, jaw clenched. His eyes scanned the messages. "He stood when my father died. He told me I mattered. He bled for us. He was there when the saints were not." He turned to Dubaku, voice flat. "They've made a cult. They've made a hope," Dubaku replied. "Because in this hell they need to believe something still stands. They must believe in him," Grimaldus snapped, pointing skyward. "Not me. But they saw you, Merek. They heard you. The Emperor may be eternal, but his miracles are distant. You were there when their children screamed, when their homes turned to dust. They don't need icons. They need something real." Grimaldus turned away. "I am not a saint." "I know," Dubaku said, "but saints are rarely made from saints." The conversation ended there, but the matter did not. In the following days, more signs emerged. In the underhives, refugees gathered in circles around makeshift fire pits, chanting a refrain. "We do not kneel, we do not break. We stand, like him." Grimaldus ordered the voxcasters broadcasting the chant destroyed. He had their meeting sites investigated, not out of cruelty, but control. His instinct told him to crush this reverence before it grew into something corrupted, before it turned faith into idolatry. But what the investigations revealed shocked even him. The cult was not growing from power or madness. It was binding the hive together. Where once there had been infighting among refugee camps, now there was order. Where hunger once led to riots, now there were food lines and rationing. Volunteers, people barely clinging to life themselves, delivered supplies to the wounded, carried messages through fire zones, repaired damaged vox towers. And when asked why, they said, "Because he wouldn't stop. So neither will we." Grimaldus summoned the senior surviving priest of Helsreach, a half-blind, rail-thin man named Father Reshel, once the caretaker of the Spire Chapel before it was vaporized in the first wave. "You've let this go unchecked," Grimaldus said. "You've let them turn me into an idol." Reshal looked at him, tired and thin-lipped. "No," he said. "I let them remember what faith looked like when everything else was ash." Grimaldus slammed his fist into the nearby column, shattering it with a growl. "I am a space marine. I am not a god." Reshal's eyes did not blink. "Good, then prove it. Continue doing what gods cannot. Walking among us." For hours after, Grimaldus remained alone in the chapel ruins, reading the scorched pages of a half-burned lectern copy of the Lectitio Divinitatus. He thought of Dorn, of Sigismund, of Mordred. None of them had wanted worship. None had desired veneration. They had desired victory, purpose, sacrifice. And still they had become more than men. That night, Grimaldus delivered a sermon, not from a fortress wall or atop a ruined tank, but in the center of a half-block courtyard, surrounded by the wounded, the broken, and the faithful. He spoke with no fury, no wrath, only truth. "I am not your light," he said. "I am only the torch that carries it." He walked among them, anointing no one, blessing no names. He left no relics, no holy water. But those who listened said the air changed when he spoke, that the very dust seemed to pause in its fall, and so the cult of the Unbroken did not die. It transformed, no longer centered around worship, but action, vigilance, strength. The people of Helsreach stopped calling themselves survivors. They called themselves followers, not of a man, but of a creed. They wore black armbands marked with a white line, simple, unadorned. It meant, we endure. And Grimaldus, though he never accepted it, never knelt beside it, and never blessed it, allowed it to remain. Because sometimes a flame must be carried, even if its bearer does not ask to be a lantern. And in a galaxy drowning in shadow, even a single flame can become legend. The wind screamed across Helsreach like a voice denied too long, howling through broken cathedrals, scouring the skin of battle-scarred tanks, and rattling the shattered remains of hive spires that once reached toward the stars. Ash fell from the sky in waves, thick as snow, each fleck another echo of what had been lost. The orcs were coming one final time, not a charge, not a skirmish, but a flood. A tide to drown everything. They came screaming from the southern trench lines, from the shattered manufactorums, from the sewer tunnels and slag pits. They poured in from the docks, from the flame-slicked refinery paths, from every wound the hive bore. This was not the endless wave of the Waa's first days. This was the last push, a final act of annihilation. Gazkul's warbands had been emboldened by the warp storm in orbit. Though the warlord himself had not returned, his lieutenants had taken his silence as permission to end it, to destroy Helsreach completely. Grimaldus knew it the moment he heard the ground tremble. Standing atop the rubble-pocked remains of Scriptorum Tower, he watched through his cracked helmet lens as the horizon bloomed with crude banners, trucks, and monstrous scrap-built engines. From his vantage, the city's last defenders looked impossibly small. Here and there, squads of Templars, battered lions, and the last handful of Primaris warriors braced along fractured barricades. Steel Legion gunners mounted rusting platforms, bayonets affixed, ammo near spent. There were no reserves, there was no backup. This was it. Grimaldus activated the Vox link. All channels. This is Reclusiarch Merek Grimaldus. Final protocol is now in effect. Defensive lines will not retreat. You will not fall back. You will not give one more inch. You will hold. You will stand. And you will deny them. There was no reply. Only the quiet hum of 100 squads preparing for the end. He stepped down from the tower slowly, each bootfall heavier than the last. Dubaku met him near the East Prometheum pipeline. His armor scorched, a fresh gash across his cheek, and his helmet tucked under one arm. Behind him, 20 lions stood in formation, wounded, limping, but eyes alight. "This is the moment," Dubaku said. Grimaldus nodded once. Let it be the one they remember. The final battle of Helsreach was not a clean engagement. It was a slaughter, and it was beautiful in its defiance. The first wave of orcs reached the barricades just after dawn. Massive war engines thundered down refinery lanes, their cannons roaring molten death. Gun towers opened fire, crack missiles spiraled skyward, flamer crews ignited the sewers. Every corner of the city burned. Grimaldus was everywhere. He moved with impossible fury, appearing at the crumbling northern wall as a kill rig smashed through, his Crozius shattering the beast's faceplate in a single blow. Moments later, he led a countercharge through the Hab district ruins, his Templars flanking a Nob pack and reducing it to cinders. He spoke no grand speeches. He gave no sermons, only orders, only death. The orcs surged again and again. Stormboys fell from the sky like meat from the heavens. Defcoptus sliced through the smog. A Gorkanaut burst from beneath the spire basilica, its claws tearing through the foundation, its bellow shaking the dust from statues of saints long dead. Grimaldus boarded it alone. Witnesses say he charged the war engine's ramp as it opened, flames licking at his armor, bolt pistol blazing. He vanished inside for 11 minutes. Then it stopped moving. It didn't explode. It simply stopped. Grimaldus walked back out through its mouth, covered in black blood, his Crozius humming with spent energy. He had crushed its pilot's skull with the butt of his weapon. No words, no triumph, just another task completed. But they were being pushed. For every orc that fell, 2 more replaced it. The southern walls collapsed by midday. The cult of the Unbroken, those civilians turned defenders, held a line for nearly an hour with nothing but salvaged lace guns and sharpened pipes before they were overrun. Father Reschel died leading them. He was torn apart as he finished reciting the litany of endurance. Grimaldus found his body in the rubble of the granary dome. He knelt, whispered something no one heard, and rose with Reschel's blood on his gauntlet. He wiped it across his left pauldron and turned north. "Next line," he said. The Primaris were falling too. Tarsidian, the captain who had once been met with cold suspicion, died shielding a wounded Templar from a burner squad. His final act was to detonate his plasma pack, incinerating the orcs trying to tear through the chapel ruins. The explosion leveled a city block, but the line held. By the time the sun set, there were barely 600 Imperial defenders left alive in Helsreach. The Vox channels crackled with static and screaming. Tech adepts committed suicide in shrine rooms, believing the Omnissiah had abandoned the city. Medical servitors roamed the blood-slicked streets without masters. And still Grimaldus fought. His armor no longer gleamed. It was fractured at the knee, smoke venting from the power core. One lens was shattered. He'd taken a chopper blow that should have split him in 2. But he didn't fall. He didn't slow. He moved like inevitability. He led the last stand at the Cathedral of the Emperor's Wounds, one of the final strongpoints not yet overrun. Banners were stitched from the remains of fallen Astartes' tabards, shrines were lit with blood-soaked candles, and around him stood the last warriors of Helsreach, Lions, Templars, Legionnaires, and even a few unarmored civilians holding weapons with both hands to stop them shaking. There were no more reinforcements, no miracles. But when the orcs came, they found not broken survivors. They found wrath. The final assault lasted 27 minutes. Grimaldus led the charge straight into the mouth of the war boss himself. A beast twice his size, wielding twin claws and a roar that made mortals drop to their knees. But the Reclusiarch didn't slow. He dodged the first swing, took the second to the pauldron, and broke the orc's arm with the twist of his Crozius. Then he drove the weapon through the war boss's mouth. When it ended, the cathedral still stood. Barely. Grimaldus emerged from the smoke with 6 survivors behind him. His armor was gone in places, his flesh burned, his voice a hoarse rasp. But he stood, and above him on the broken wall of the cathedral, the black and white of the Black Templars still flew, torn, blood-soaked and beautiful. They say he collapsed only after the orcs finally fled, after the last greenskin was put down, after the guns went silent. When they found him in the nave, he was sitting before the altar, his Crozius across his lap, his gaze fixed on the broken mural of the Emperor behind it. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The silence said enough. The war for Helsreach was over. But Merek Grimaldus, the Reclusiarch, the torchbearer, the unbroken voice, had endured, and now the galaxy would remember that even in the darkest hour, there was a man who stood and did not fall. When the last orc was slain and the smoke began to clear, Helsreach did not celebrate. There was no cheering, no victory banners unfurled. The silence that followed was not peace, but exhaustion. the kind of silence that sinks into bones and does not lift, the kind of silence found only in places that have lost too much. Merek Grimaldus awoke 2 days later beneath a fractured stained glass dome, surrounded by dying candles and the soft hum of generator servitors. The chapel had no name. The saints depicted in its cracked frescoes had long since flaked away. It had been a shelter, a triage station, and now, briefly, a tomb that failed in its duty. He rose slowly. His chest plate had been removed and lay in the dust beside him, broken clean through at the left shoulder. His ribs were bound with synth flesh and plasteel gauze. Pain flared through every limb as he stood, not sharp like a wound, but deep like an old scar remembered too soon. A servo skull drifted beside him, its red lens blinking softly. Reclusiarch, it chirped. Vitals within acceptable parameters. Directive, rejoin command authority. Note, your survival probability was assessed at 3.5%. Grimaldus waved it away. He did not survive by numbers. Outside, Helsreach was smoke and ruin. The central manufactorums were gone, collapsed into themselves like dying stars. Hab blocks stood as jagged teeth across the skyline. Bridges, once crawling with refugees and war machines, had snapped and tumbled into the wastes. The river was choked with wreckage, but still the city lived. A thin line of ash-marked banners flew from the surviving bastions. Makeshift litanies were scrawled across walls in chalk and blood, and here and there, candles burned in silence, guarded by those who had lost everything and yet still believed. Grimaldus descended from the chapel alone. No escort, no ceremony. Word of his awakening had already spread. Within hours, lines formed around the church ruins. Civilians, guardsmen, Mechanicus survivors, even a few bruised and limping Astartes, all waiting to see him. Not to speak, not to praise, just to see. To be sure he was real. The last living standard of Helsreach. Dubaku found him shortly after. The celestial lion wore a new mark across his chest plate. A gold two-headed lion rearing over a field of stars, a symbol of rebirth. His armor was freshly oiled, though still scarred. A new banner hung from his backpack, stitched from the torn remnants of dozens of fallen brothers' tabards. "We've begun the burn rites," Dubaku said. "Orc corpses are being incinerated in the trenches. The Black Priests of Steel Legion Command have declared the plague risk contained." Grimaldus nodded. "And the refugees? Still too many. Still not enough food. But they listen now. Order is returning." He hesitated. "And the cult?" Grimaldus looked away. "Still chanting." "They no longer chant your name," Dubaku said softly. "They chant the creed of Helsreach. You gave them something to shape themselves around. It's not you they worship now. It's what you reminded them they could be." Grimaldus was silent for a long time. "They say the Emperor works through his servants," he said finally, "but I never expected his hand to feel so heavy." Dubaku smiled without humor. "That's what it means to lead." That evening, in the shadow of the broken cathedral, Grimaldus led a ceremony of remembrance, not a sermon. His voice was still raw, and there were no hymns left, only silence. They lit 1,000 candles for the fallen. Each flame was named. Dubaku named his first fallen mentor. A guardsman named Marta recited her squad's designations one by one, even as her voice trembled. A child placed a single melted bolt shell at the base of the shrine, whispering her father's name. She could not have been older than 10. Grimaldus said nothing. He simply stood vigil, as he always had. When the ceremony ended, a courier approached, clad in the uniform of the Adeptus Administratum, escorted by 2 Skitari bodyguards and a Vox servitor. She saluted crisply, but her eyes showed fatigue beyond even a bureaucrat's usual weariness. "I bring message crypt from Segmentum Solar, Reclusiarch," she said. "Classified at high command level. Your authorization seal is embedded." Grimaldus took the data slate. Its title line was brief. Order of transfer, Crusade reassignment. Dubaku, watching nearby, tilted his head. "New war?" Grimaldus nodded. "Always." He read through the text. Orders issued by the High Lords themselves, signed by a representative of the Lord Commander Guilliman. It spoke of the ongoing Second Indomitus Crusade, of worlds newly discovered burning under the eye of chaos, of a need for voices like his, unbroken voices, to lead new charges into the abyss. It also made one other thing clear. Helsreach was no longer his war zone. It was won. Held. Saved. Barely. That night, Grimaldus returned to the Spire Chapel ruins. He found the sword, not his own, not the Crozius, which remained at his side, eternally scorched, but another, a simple blade, broken in half, once wielded by a neophyte who had died in the first days of the siege. He held it, turned it in his hand, and drove it into the ground at the chapel altar. A marker. A promise. The next morning, as his Thunderhawk lifted from the Hive's battered landing zone, thousands stood to watch. No banners waved, no trumpets played, but every single soul stood straight, and every single one placed a fist over their chest. The Black Templars had not just held a city, they had forged a legend. And Merek Grimaldus, Reclusiarch of the Eternal Crusade, was now something else. Not a god, not a saint, just a sword in the dust, ready to rise again.